Before you watch this story, I want you to imagine receiving a message like this. Grace, if you're reading this, it means I finally understand the damage I caused. I spent months trying to convince myself that what I said at my pre-wedding celebration was just a joke, but jokes don't destroy trust. Careless choices do. I wasn't trapped by you. I was trapped by my own immaturity, and by the time I realized the difference, I'd already lost the best woman who had ever loved me. Now let me ask you something. What would you do if the person you were about to marry laughed in front of his closest friends and said, "I can't believe I'm stuck with her for life," never knowing you were standing just a few feet away, listening to every word? Would you tell yourself it was only a joke because the wedding invitations had already been mailed? Would you forgive him because everyone else expected you to? Or would you quietly walk away, even if it meant leaving behind the future you'd spent years building? Today's story isn't just about a broken engagement. It's about the quiet decisions that shape our lives in ways we never expect. Sometimes the smallest choice, showing up somewhere you almost skipped, staying silent instead of arguing, or choosing your dignity over someone else's approval, can completely rewrite your future. Stay with me until the very end, because this story proves that love isn't measured by how long someone stays. It's measured by how deeply they respect you when they think no one is watching. Before we begin, welcome to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, where every story is inspired by real-life emotions, meaningful choices, and the lessons that help us become better partners, better friends, and better people. If stories about love, self-respect, second chances, and life-changing decisions speak to your heart, take a moment to subscribe, turn on notifications, and become part of our growing family. And while you're here, tell us in the comments. If you overheard your fiancé say, "I can't believe I'm stuck with her for life," would you cancel the wedding or give them a chance to explain? Your answer might change by the time this story ends. Now, let's begin. Grace Mitchell almost didn't go. At exactly 5:42 on a warm Friday evening in early June, she sat alone in her office at Jefferson Elementary School in Madison, Wisconsin, staring at the unopened garment bag hanging from the back of her office door. Inside was the navy blue cocktail dress she'd bought 3 weeks earlier for her fiancé's pre-wedding celebration. A casual gathering his best man had insisted would be just food, music, and old friends. She rubbed her temples and let out a slow breath. The day had been longer than she expected. One of her fourth-grade students had spent nearly an hour crying in her office after learning his parents were separating. Grace had stayed late making phone calls, comforting him, and arranging support with the school social worker. By the time the building emptied, the emotional weight of the day clung to her shoulders. Her phone buzzed. Her older sister, Vanessa. "Are you on your way home yet?" Grace smiled faintly before typing. "Still at school." A reply came almost instantly. "You better leave soon. Tonight is Ethan's party." Grace looked across her quiet office. "I know," she whispered to herself. Another message appeared. "You're not thinking about skipping it, are you?" She hesitated before replying. "Honestly, I might." The 3 blinking dots appeared almost immediately. "Grace, you've been looking forward to marrying Ethan for 4 years. Go home, shower, put on that beautiful dress, and enjoy yourself. You deserve one carefree evening." Grace leaned back in her chair. Did she? Lately, carefree felt like a word that belonged to someone else. Wedding planning had consumed nearly every free moment of the past 6 months. Between finalizing seating charts, meeting vendors, balancing work, and helping Ethan prepare for a major architectural presentation, she felt more like a project manager than a bride. She loved Ethan. At least, she believed she did. He was intelligent, driven, dependable in many ways, and ambitious enough to inspire everyone around him. He remembered anniversaries, opened doors for strangers, and volunteered twice a year with Habitat for Humanity. On paper, he was exactly the kind of man she'd once prayed for. Yet, lately, something had changed. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice. It was the little things. Conversations that ended with him checking his phone. Plans adjusted around his work, but never hers. Jokes that left her smiling politely while wondering why they made her feel small. Nothing serious. Nothing she could point to and say, "This is wrong." Just tiny moments that drifted through her mind long after they happened. She stood and walked to the office window. Outside, parents loaded children into cars, while teachers headed home for the weekend. Everyone was moving forward. So why did she suddenly feel like standing still? Her phone rang. "Ethan." She answered. "Hey, there you are," he said cheerfully. "I thought you'd already be getting ready." "I just finished work." "You work too hard." She laughed softly. "I could say the same thing." "Listen," he said. "Don't stress about tonight. It's just the guys, a few friends, some family members. You'll know almost everyone." "I know. And don't stay too late if you're tired." "You sure?" "Absolutely." His voice sounded warm, comforting, exactly like the man she'd fallen in love with. For a moment, all her doubts disappeared. "I'll be there," she said. "That's my girl." They ended the call. Grace looked once more at the garment bag. "I almost stayed home," she murmured. Had she done that? 45 minutes later, Grace pulled into the parking lot of the Copper Lantern, a renovated historic restaurant overlooking Lake Monona. String lights glowed above the outdoor patio. Music floated through the warm evening air. Laughter echoed from inside. She checked her reflection in the mirror. The navy blue dress fit perfectly. Simple silver earrings, natural makeup, hair pulled neatly over one shoulder. Nothing extravagant. She'd never liked drawing attention to herself. As she stepped from the car, she carried a neatly wrapped gift she'd spent weeks choosing, a handcrafted walnut desk organizer engraved with Ethan's initials and the date of their upcoming wedding. She smiled. He was going to love it. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Friends greeted one another. Servers carried trays of appetizers. Families mingled comfortably. A banner stretched across one wall. 1 week to go. Grace laughed quietly. 1 week. After 4 years together. 1 more week, until forever. "Grace!" She turned. Ethan's mother embraced her tightly. "You look beautiful." "Thank you. We've been waiting for you." Grace glanced around. "Where's Ethan?" "Outside with the guys." She nodded. "I'll go surprise him." Gift in hand, she made her way toward the patio doors. As she approached, she slowed. Ethan's laughter carried through the open doorway. She smiled instinctively. She loved hearing him laugh. It reminded her of their first road trip together, when they'd gotten hopelessly lost in rural Minnesota and laughed until sunrise over burnt gas station coffee. Maybe she had been worrying too much. Maybe marriage jitters were normal. Maybe all couples experience seasons of uncertainty. She reached for the door, then stopped. Someone outside spoke first. "So, one of Ethan's college friends chuckled. Ready for married life?" More laughter. Grace smiled. She waited. Ethan answered. His voice was relaxed, comfortable, completely unaware she was only a few feet away, and then he laughed again. "Man!" There was another pause. The group leaned in. Ethan shook his head, lifted his drink slightly, and with a grin that sounded far too effortless, said the 7 words that would change every plan Grace had made for her future. "I can't believe I'm stuck with her for life." For one long, unbearable second, the world seemed to stop. The music from the restaurant faded into the background. The laughter from nearby tables blurred into meaningless noise. Even the warm summer breeze that had been drifting across the patio felt strangely distant. Grace stood frozen just outside the open patio door, her fingers still wrapped around the ribbon of Ethan's gift bag. Surely she had misheard him. She wanted to believe that. She needed to. Then another round of laughter erupted from the group. One of Ethan's friends, Ryan, slapped him on the shoulder. "Too late now, man," he joked. "You've already signed your freedom away." The men laughed again. Ethan smirked. "I know," he replied, shaking his head dramatically. "Guess this is what happens when you wait until your mid-30s. You wake up one day and realize you're about to spend the rest of your life discussing paint colors and throw pillows." More laughter. Someone raised a glass. "To Ethan," another friend called out. "The bravest man in Madison." Glasses clinked. Grace felt something inside her quietly crack. It wasn't only the words. It was how easily they came. There had been no hesitation, no awkward pause, no indication that he was forcing a joke he didn't actually believe. He had sounded comfortable, natural, as if this was how he truly spoke about her when she wasn't around. She remained hidden behind the doorway, unable to move. Another man spoke. "Come on," he teased. "Grace seems like a great woman." Ethan shrugged. "Oh, she is." He took another sip of his drink. "She's kind, dependable, organized." He paused. "Sometimes too organized." A few people chuckled. "But honestly," Ethan continued, "marriage changes everything. You lose a little freedom. That's just reality." Ryan laughed. "So, you're settling?" Ethan grinned. "I'm saying every marriage comes with compromises." Grace stared at the floor. Compromises. Was that what she had become? A compromise? The woman he'd chosen because it made sense. The woman he joked about enduring? She replayed the last 4 years in her mind. The road trips, holiday dinners, helping him study for his professional licensing exam, sitting beside him through long nights while he finished architectural designs, bringing him dinner when deadlines kept him at the office, listening when work overwhelmed him, celebrating every promotion, supporting every dream. Never once had she thought of loving him as something she was stuck doing. Love had always been a choice, one she gladly made, every single day. Until now. Just then, one of the men turned toward the doorway. His smile disappeared. "Oh, Everyone followed his gaze. The conversation died instantly. Ethan turned. His face lost all color. Grace. The gift bag slipped slightly in her hand. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched painfully between them. Finally, Ethan stepped forward. Babe. She looked at him. Not angrily, not dramatically, simply, quietly. The kind of quiet that comes when disappointment settles deeper than tears. You heard that? He asked. She nodded once. Nobody else dared speak. Ryan suddenly became fascinated with his shoes. Another friend slowly backed away toward the bar. Ethan forced a nervous laugh. It wasn't what it sounded like. Grace blinked. What did it sound like? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I was joking. She studied his face. There was panic there now. Embarrassment. Fear. But not because he'd hurt her. Because he'd been caught. One of his cousins tried to help. Grace, honestly, all the guys were joking around. Another added, yeah, don't take it personally. Someone else laughed awkwardly. Men say stupid things around each other. Grace finally spoke. So, I should expect my future husband to disrespect me whenever I'm not in the room. No one answered. Ethan stepped closer. I didn't mean it like that. How did you mean it? Again, silence. He couldn't explain it, because there was no explanation that could erase what she'd heard. He reached for her hand. She gently stepped back, not out of anger, out of instinct. The movement hurt him more than any shouted argument could have. Grace, please. She looked down at the carefully wrapped gift. Hours earlier, she'd imagined giving it to him with a smile. Now it felt strangely heavy. She extended it toward him. I bought this because I thought tonight was a celebration. He stared at the package. She continued quietly. But I don't think either of us feels like celebrating anymore. She placed the gift in his hands. He didn't know whether to hold it or hand it back. I love you, he said quickly. I know. And I didn't mean... I believe you love me. He looked relieved for half a second. Then she finished. But I'm not sure you respect me. The words landed harder than anything she could have shouted. His shoulders sank. Around them, the patio remained painfully silent. Even the restaurant staff seemed to sense they were witnessing something deeply personal. Grace took a slow breath. When someone believes they're speaking privately, she said, they usually reveal the version of themselves they don't think needs editing. Ethan lowered his eyes. She wasn't trying to humiliate him. She wasn't trying to win an argument. She was simply telling the truth. And truth often hurts more than anger. I've spent 4 years believing we were choosing each other, she continued. Tonight I learned you think you're trapped. I don't. I heard you. It was a stupid joke. She nodded slowly. Maybe it was. He looked hopeful. But every joke has a target. His hope disappeared. And tonight, she whispered, the target was me. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall here. Not because crying was weakness, because she wanted to leave with the dignity she still had. She turned toward the exit. Grace! He hurried after her. Please don't leave. She stopped walking, but didn't turn around. If our wedding happens, she said softly, I need to know I'm marrying someone who's proud to spend his life with me. She looked over her shoulder. Not someone who feels stuck. Then she walked away. No dramatic scene. No screaming. No throwing the ring. No public humiliation. Just quiet footsteps echoing across the wooden deck. Sometimes, silence carries more weight than shouting ever could. The drive home felt endless. Grace turned off the radio after less than a minute. She couldn't bear the sound of cheerful music. At a red light, she glanced at the engagement ring sparkling on her finger. For 4 years, it had symbolized hope. Tonight, it felt different. Not meaningless. Just uncertain. Her phone rang. Ethan. She let it ring. Again and again. Then came the messages. Please answer. I'm sorry. Can we talk? Please don't do this. I love you. Grace read every message. She replied to none. When she reached her apartment, she slipped off her heels, sat alone on the edge of her bed, and stared at the ring. She remembered something her late father used to tell her when she was a little girl. Pay attention to how people speak about others, and how they speak about you when they think there's nothing to lose. Character doesn't hide forever. At the time, she hadn't fully understood what he meant. Tonight, she did. Slowly, she slid the engagement ring from her finger. She didn't throw it. She didn't hide it. She placed it carefully inside its velvet box and closed the lid with trembling hands. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. Neighbors laughed. Life moved forward. But inside Grace's apartment, a future she had spent years planning quietly came apart. Not because of one careless sentence alone, but because that sentence revealed a truth she could no longer ignore. She looked at the closed ring box, wiped a tear from her cheek, and whispered into the silence, "Sometimes the hardest choice isn't leaving someone you love. It's refusing to stay where respect has already begun to disappear." Before we continue, I want to hear from you. If you were standing where Grace stood and overheard the person you were about to marry say, "I can't believe I'm stuck with her for life," what would you do? Would you believe it was just a joke? Or would you see it as a warning about the future? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could encourage someone facing a similar situation to choose wisdom, dignity, and self-respect. And if this story is already touching your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story about love, life, and the choices that shape our future. Now, let's continue, because Grace's hardest decision is still ahead. Grace barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the same sentence again. "I can't believe I'm stuck with her for life." The words didn't grow quieter with time. Instead, they echoed differently each time, attaching themselves to memories that had once made her smile. She remembered Ethan introducing her at a company dinner. "This is Grace. She's the organized one in the relationship." Everyone had laughed. At the time, she'd laughed too. Now she wondered if that had also been a joke at her expense. She remembered cancelling a weekend trip with her college friends because Ethan needed help preparing for a major presentation. She remembered spending an entire Saturday assembling bookshelves in the condo they'd planned to move into after the wedding, while Ethan worked late. She remembered the countless small sacrifices she'd made without keeping score because she believed love wasn't about winning or losing. Now one question refused to leave her mind. Had he ever valued those sacrifices the way she valued his? Sunlight slipped through the curtains as Grace sat at her kitchen table, untouched coffee cooling beside her. Her engagement ring remained inside its velvet box. She looked at it, but made no move to put it back on. Her phone buzzed for what felt like the 100th time. 23 missed calls, 14 voicemails, 37 text messages, all from Ethan. She read only the latest. "Please don't make one stupid joke bigger than 4 years together." Grace stared at the screen. One stupid joke. That was how he saw it. Not a wound, not a betrayal, just a misunderstanding. She quietly locked her phone and set it face down. At 9 o'clock, there was a knock at her apartment door. She already knew who it was. Vanessa. Her older sister never announced herself with texts when something serious had happened. She simply showed up. Grace opened the door. Vanessa took one look at her younger sister's face and immediately pulled her into a hug. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Vanessa whispered, "What happened?" Grace stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was unusually quiet. Normally Grace would have fresh flowers on the table, soft jazz playing in the background, and breakfast already made for anyone who visited. Today, there was only silence. Vanessa noticed the unopened wedding magazines stacked neatly beside the couch. The seating chart still rested on the dining table. Tiny cards with guests' names were arranged in careful rows. Grace had spent weeks organizing them. Now they looked like plans made by someone else. Vanessa sat across from her. "Tell me everything." Grace took a deep breath. She recounted the evening from beginning to end. How she almost skipped the party. How she'd arrived with Ethan's gift. How she'd paused outside the patio. How she'd heard every word. Vanessa listened without interrupting. When Grace finished, tears finally escaped, despite her best efforts. "I keep asking myself if I'm overreacting." Vanessa answered immediately, "No." But everyone there acted like I should laugh it off. Everyone there wasn't the one being laughed about. Grace lowered her eyes. "I keep wondering if it really was just a joke." Vanessa leaned forward. "Grace," she waited until her sister met her eyes. "The problem isn't whether he was joking. It's why that joke felt natural to him." Grace sat quietly. Vanessa continued gently. "A joke usually exaggerates something people already believe." The words settled heavily between them. Later that afternoon, Grace drove to her mother's house on the outskirts of Madison. The familiar white farmhouse had always been a place of peace. Her mother, Patricia Mitchell, greeted her with warm concern. "I wasn't expecting you today." Grace forced a smile. "I needed to see you." Within minutes, they were sitting on the back porch, overlooking a small vegetable garden her late father had planted years earlier. Patricia handed Grace a glass of iced tea. "You've been crying." Grace nodded. "I don't know what to do." Her mother remained silent. She had never been the type to rush advice. Instead, she believed people often discovered their own answers if someone simply listened long enough. Grace explained everything. When she finished, Patricia looked toward the garden. "Do you remember your father's tomato plants?" Grace blinked. "What?" "The first summer we planted them." Grace smiled faintly. "They died. They almost died. Her mother corrected her gently. Do you remember why? Grace thought for a moment. We watered them too much. Patricia nodded. Your father kept trying to fix them by doing more. She smiled sadly. But eventually he realized that good intentions don't always solve the real problem. Grace listened. If the roots are unhealthy, Patricia continued, watering the leaves won't save the plant. Grace understood immediately. You think this is about more than one sentence. I think that sentence made you question the roots. Neither spoke for a while. A breeze rustled the trees. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the fence. Finally, Patricia reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. Marriage isn't about finding someone who never says the wrong thing. Grace nodded. It's about finding someone who understands why the wrong thing matters. That evening, Grace began noticing something she had ignored for years. Her memories were changing. Not because the past itself had changed, but because she was finally viewing it through a different lens. She remembered Ethan teasing her during a friend's barbecue. Grace probably has a spreadsheet for how to load the dishwasher. Everyone laughed, including her. Another memory surfaced. They had been shopping for furniture. Grace suggested choosing something within budget. Ethan smiled at the salesman. She's always the practical one. Somebody has to stop me from having fun. Again, everyone laughed. She had laughed too. Then came another memory. A dinner with Ethan's co-workers. One of them had complimented Grace for volunteering at the youth literacy program. Before she could answer, Ethan interrupted. Yeah, she's basically allergic to saying no. If someone asked her to paint the moon, she'd probably make a schedule for it. People chuckled. At the time, she thought he was simply being playful. Now she realized something. Every joke had painted her as predictable. Controlling, overly serious, useful, never admired, never cherished, useful. The realization hurt more than the original sentence, because it wasn't just one joke. It was a pattern she had mistaken for affection. Grace closed her eyes. For years she'd ignored those moments, because none of them seemed important on their own. But together, they formed a picture she could no longer unsee. Just then, her phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't Ethan. It was an email from the wedding venue. Final guest count due in 3 days. Grace stared at the message for several seconds. Then she quietly closed her laptop, without responding. For the first time since the engagement, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had refused to imagine. What if the wedding never happened? The thought terrified her, but, strangely, it also brought the first small sense of peace she had felt since the night before. Grace spent most of Saturday doing something she had avoided for months. Nothing. No wedding checklists, no vendor calls, no seating charts, no color palettes. For the first time since Ethan had proposed, her calendar was completely empty. It should have felt unsettling. Instead, it felt strangely honest. She folded a blanket over the back of her couch, watered the plants on her balcony, and cleaned the kitchen simply because it gave her hands something to do while her mind tried to catch up with her heart. Every few minutes, she reached for her phone. Not to call Ethan. To see if she was ready to. Around noon, her phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Ethan. It was Megan, her maid of honor and closest friend since college. Grace answered. Hi. There was a pause. I've been trying to reach you since last night. I know. I heard something happened. Grace closed her eyes. I'll tell you everything. For nearly 40 minutes, she explained what had happened at the party. Unlike everyone else, Megan never interrupted. When Grace finished, the silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Finally, Megan sighed. You know what hurts the most? What? Not what he said. Grace frowned. The fact that nobody stopped him. Grace thought about the patio. Ryan had laughed. His cousins had laughed. His co-workers had laughed. Someone had even raised a toast. No one had looked uncomfortable until they realized she had heard. Megan continued. When people respect someone, they usually defend them when they're not around. Grace looked out the window. I never thought about that. That's because you've always been the one defending everyone else. That afternoon, Ethan sat alone inside the condominium he and Grace had purchased together 6 months earlier. The living room looked exactly as Grace had arranged it. Family photographs sat neatly on floating shelves. The dining table held the centerpiece she had chosen during one of their weekend shopping trips. A framed sign hung near the kitchen. Home is built with love. Ethan stared at it for a long time. He remembered teasing Grace for buying it. It's a little cheesy, he'd laughed. She'd smiled. Maybe. But it's true. Now the words felt heavier than they ever had before. His phone showed dozens of unanswered calls. Every message he'd sent remained unread. He rubbed both hands across his face. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive anymore. He was confused. How had one sentence undone 4 years? His older brother Mark knocked before letting himself inside. "You look terrible." "I feel worse." Mark sat across from him. "I heard." Ethan nodded. "I messed up." "You did." "I was joking." Mark looked at him calmly. "I believe you." Relief crossed Ethan's face, for exactly 1 second. Then Mark added, "That doesn't make it harmless." Ethan frowned. "I never meant to humiliate her." "I know. Then why is everyone acting like I'm some terrible person?" Mark leaned back. "They're not. They're acting like your words revealed something." Ethan looked away. "I love Grace." "I know you do. I've spent years building a life with her." "I know. So why would she think I don't want to marry her?" Mark folded his arms. "Because the happiest day of your life shouldn't sound like a prison sentence." The room became painfully quiet. Ethan replayed his own words. "I'm stuck with her for life." Hearing them now made him cringe, not because they sounded offensive, because they sounded careless, and careless was the last thing Grace deserved. Sunday morning arrived with another difficult decision. Grace opened her laptop. The email from the wedding venue still waited. Final guest count due Monday. She stared at the blinking cursor. Then she opened another document. Wedding budget. Every deposit. Every payment. Every reservation. Nearly 2 years of planning. Thousands of dollars. Hundreds of hours. All connected to one date. June 13th. 1 week away. She closed the spreadsheet. Money mattered. Time mattered. But neither mattered as much as making the right decision. Her grandmother had once told her, "It's cheaper to cancel a wedding than repair a miserable marriage." At the time, Grace had laughed. Now she finally understood. That evening, someone knocked on her apartment door. She looked through the peephole. Ethan. He stood outside, holding no flowers. No expensive gifts. No dramatic display. Just himself. His shoulders looked tired. His eyes were swollen from lack of sleep. Grace considered pretending she wasn't home. Instead, she opened the door just enough to speak. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you." "I don't think that's a good idea." "I know," he nodded, "but I couldn't keep apologizing through text messages." Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Grace stepped outside, quietly closing the apartment door behind her. The hallway remained empty. "I won't keep you long," Ethan said. "I promise." She folded her arms. "I'm listening." He swallowed hard. "I've replayed last night 100 times. So have I." "I'm ashamed." Grace believed him. That surprised her, not because shame erased what had happened, but because it seemed genuine. "I wasn't trying to hurt you." "I know. I was trying to fit in." Grace looked at him carefully. "With who?" "The guys." "So respecting me became negotiable?" He lowered his head. "I didn't think." "Exactly." The words landed softly, not angrily, sadly. "You didn't think about how your words would make me feel." He nodded. "You're right. I've heard that sentence before." He frowned. "What sentence?" "I was just trying to fit in." She sighed. "It's amazing how often people sacrifice someone they love just to impress people whose opinions won't matter next week." Ethan couldn't argue. Because she was right. "I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you." Grace shook her head gently. "That's the problem." He looked confused. "You keep talking about making it up to me. What else can I do?" She answered quietly. "Understand why it happened in the first place." He opened his mouth, then closed it, because for the first time, he realized something. He had spent 2 days trying to convince Grace that he wasn't a bad man. He had spent almost no time asking himself why disrespect had come so naturally. That realization frightened him. Grace reached into her purse. She removed the small velvet ring box. Ethan's heart immediately sank. She placed it in his hands. "I'm not ending our relationship today." Hope flickered across his face. "But I'm not marrying you next week." His hope disappeared. "The wedding is postponed." The hallway fell silent. "I need time." He nodded slowly. "I understand." "No." She looked directly into his eyes. "I don't think you do." He stared at the ring box resting in his palm. "This isn't punishment. It's protection." She continued. "If we get married before rebuilding respect, we'll spend years trying to repair something that should have been strong before the vows." A tear rolled down Ethan's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Grace noticed. For the first time since the party, she saw not the confident architect everyone admired. She saw a man confronting the consequences of his own choices. And consequences, she realized, were often life's greatest teachers. "I truly hope you become the man I believed you already were," she said softly. Then she turned and walked back into her apartment. This time, Ethan didn't try to stop her. He simply stood in the quiet hallway, holding an engagement ring that suddenly felt far heavier than gold. The next morning, Grace received a phone call she wasn't expecting. "Hello, is this Grace Mitchell?" "Yes." "Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm the volunteer coordinator for the Madison Community Youth Center." Grace frowned slightly. "I think you have the wrong number." Lisa laughed gently. "Actually, your former college professor, Dr. Eleanor Hayes, recommended you." Grace smiled with surprise. "Professor Hayes?" "She said you're wonderful with young people and community programs. We're launching a summer mentoring and renovation project next week, and we're looking for volunteers with counseling experience." Grace hesitated. Normally she would have declined. There was too much happening, too much uncertainty. But then she looked around her quiet apartment. Maybe sitting alone replaying the past wasn't the only way to heal. "When does it start?" she asked. Lisa smiled on the other end of the phone. "Monday morning." Grace looked out the window at the bright summer sky. For the first time in days, she heard herself say something she hadn't expected. "I'll be there." She had no idea that accepting one simple invitation would introduce her to people, and one man in particular, who would quietly reshape the future she thought she'd already lost. Monday morning arrived with a quiet kind of hope. Not the hopeful excitement Grace had imagined feeling 1 week before her wedding. This hope was different, smaller, more cautious. It wasn't the certainty that life would suddenly improve. It was simply the willingness to keep moving. Grace parked outside the Madison Community Youth Center 20 minutes before the volunteer orientation was scheduled to begin. The building was older than she expected. Its brick walls had faded after decades of Wisconsin winters. Several windows needed replacing, and the playground behind the center showed signs of years of heavy use. The basketball court's painted lines had almost disappeared beneath cracked asphalt. Yet children were already laughing outside. 2 boys chased each other across the playground, while an older volunteer patiently pushed a little girl on a swing. Grace smiled. Some places carried more heart than polish. She stepped out of her car, adjusted the strap of her tote bag, and walked toward the entrance. A large banner hung over the front doors. "Building stronger futures together." She paused for a moment. Those words felt strangely personal. She wasn't just helping rebuild a community center. She was trying to rebuild herself. Inside, volunteers gathered around folding tables covered with blueprints, paint samples, schedules, and stacks of name tags. The atmosphere buzzed with friendly conversation. Retirees, college students, teachers, parents, business owners, people from different walks of life had come together for one purpose. Grace collected her name tag. "Good morning." A cheerful woman with short grey hair extended her hand. "I'm Lisa." Grace smiled. "The mysterious caller." Lisa laughed. "And you actually came." "I almost didn't." "Well, I'm glad you changed your mind." Grace thought quietly. "So am I." After everyone settled into their seats, Lisa welcomed the group. "Our goal isn't simply to repair this building." She gestured toward the windows overlooking the playground. "Our goal is to remind every child who walks through these doors that someone believes they're worth investing in." The room became silent. Grace immediately understood why Professor Hayes had recommended this place. This wasn't charity, it was community. Lisa continued. "Some of you will mentor students. Some will help with landscaping. Some will organize donations. And some of you have professional experience that will help us renovate the building safely." She smiled toward the back of the room. "Which brings me to our project coordinator." Several volunteers turned. A tall man stepped forward carrying a rolled-up set of construction plans. He looked to be in his late 30s. Broad shoulders, simple blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, khaki work pants, worn leather boots. There was nothing flashy about him. No expensive watch. No designer clothes. Just quiet confidence. He introduced himself. "Good morning." His voice was calm. "I'm Daniel Carter." He smiled politely. "I'm a civil engineer with the city. I'll be overseeing the renovation to make sure everything is safe before the children return for the fall programs." Grace noticed something immediately. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply explained the work. No unnecessary jokes, no exaggerated confidence, just clarity. She appreciated that. Daniel spent the next 30 minutes walking everyone through the renovation plans. He explained where new classrooms would be built, which walls could safely be removed, why the playground equipment needed replacing. Even people with no construction experience found themselves understanding. Grace admired the way he spoke, patiently, respectfully, never making anyone feel unintelligent for asking questions. When one elderly volunteer apologized for asking what she called a silly question, Daniel smiled. There are no silly questions when children's safety is involved. Grace noticed several volunteers visibly relax. She couldn't help comparing the moment to Ethan. Ethan had often answered questions quickly, efficiently, sometimes brilliantly, but not always patiently. She caught herself. Stop comparing. Daniel wasn't Ethan. And Ethan wasn't Daniel. This wasn't about choosing between two men. It was about learning to see people more clearly than she had before. After orientation, volunteers split into small teams. Grace was assigned to organize donated books for the youth reading room. Daniel approached carrying a clipboard. Grace, Mitchell? Yes. I'm pairing your team with ours. She looked at the schedule. I thought we were working inside. You are, he smiled. But before we can install the new bookshelves, we need to measure the walls. She nodded. Makes sense. I'll only need about 15 minutes. Together, they entered an empty classroom where old furniture had already been removed. Daniel knelt beside one wall, extending a measuring tape. Grace held the opposite end. 87 inches. She wrote it down. They repeated the process several times. Their work settled into a comfortable rhythm. Quiet. Efficient. At one point, Daniel accidentally dropped his pencil. Grace bent to pick it up. So did he. Their hands almost touched. Both immediately pulled back. You first, Daniel said. Grace laughed softly. No, you. He smiled. See? What? We've already reached our first construction disagreement. She chuckled. I think we'll survive. His smile widened briefly before he returned to measuring. An hour later, the volunteers gathered outside for lunch. Several people formed small groups beneath large maple trees. Grace sat alone with a sandwich she had packed that morning. She wasn't avoiding anyone. She simply wasn't ready for too much conversation. Daniel noticed. After hesitating for a moment, he walked over carrying his lunch. Mind if I join you? Of course. He sat on the opposite end of the picnic bench, leaving plenty of space between them. Grace appreciated the gesture. Some people assumed friendliness meant ignoring personal boundaries. Daniel didn't. They ate quietly for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. So, she looked up. What brought you here? Grace considered how much to share. I work as a school counselor. That explains why Lisa seemed excited when you arrived. You know Lisa well? We've worked together on community projects for years. He smiled. She has a talent for convincing good people to volunteer. Grace laughed. I've noticed. What about you? Daniel looked toward the playground. I grew up about 3 blocks from here. You did? He nodded. This place kept me out of trouble more times than I can count. So, now you're giving back? Trying to. Grace admired the simplicity of his answer. He didn't make himself sound heroic. He simply saw a need and chose to help. After lunch, the volunteers returned to work. Grace and Daniel reviewed the layout for the reading room. Grace studied the blueprint. I have an idea. Daniel looked over. What if we move the bookshelves to this wall instead? He frowned slightly. Why? More natural light. He glanced toward the windows. It would look nicer. Grace nodded. And children naturally spend more time reading in spaces that feel open. Daniel studied the drawing again. I was thinking about structural balance. I was thinking about child behavior. They exchanged thoughtful looks. Neither interrupted, neither insisted. They were right. Finally, Daniel smiled. What if we test both options? Grace blinked. You'd do that? Why wouldn't I? I don't know. He shrugged. The best idea wins. Not my idea. Not your idea. The best one. Grace smiled. I like that. Within 30 minutes, they rearranged the temporary shelving both ways. Lisa walked in. Oh, this feels much brighter. Daniel nodded toward Grace. Her idea. Lisa looked impressed. Grace smiled. Daniel could easily have taken credit. Instead, he gave it freely. It was a small moment. But after everything she'd experienced with Ethan, it stood out more than he realized. Late that afternoon, volunteers began packing up. Grace gathered her things when Lisa approached. You and Daniel worked well together. Grace smiled politely. He's easy to work with. Lisa laughed. He usually is. Daniel walked over carrying several boxes. I'll take those to storage. Grace picked up another box. I can help. You've done enough today. So have you. He smiled. I won't argue. Together, they carried supplies down the hallway. Neither noticed Professor Hayes standing near the entrance, watching them from a distance. She smiled quietly to herself. Sometimes, healing didn't begin with dramatic life changes. Sometimes it began with 2 strangers carrying boxes down the same hallway. Neither knew where the path would lead, but both had already taken the first step. As Grace placed the final box on the storage shelf, Daniel looked at tomorrow's schedule and said, If you're coming back in the morning. He hesitated just long enough to make Grace curious. I could use your opinion on something important. Grace tilted her head. My opinion? He nodded. I think you'll understand the people using this building better than I do. She smiled. I'll be here. Neither of them realized that what seemed like an ordinary conversation would become the beginning of a friendship built not on instant attraction, but on something far more lasting. Respect. Grace arrived at the Madison Community Youth Center 10 minutes early the next morning. For the first time in days, she had slept through the night. Not perfectly. There were still moments when memories of Ethan surfaced without warning. She still caught herself wondering whether postponing the wedding had been the right decision. But those thoughts no longer controlled every minute of her day. She parked beneath the same maple tree as the day before and noticed Daniel's pickup truck already sitting near the loading dock. He was earlier than everyone else. As she walked toward the building, she found him kneeling beside the front entrance with a tape measure. Good morning, she called. Daniel looked up and smiled. Morning. You've been here long? About half an hour. Grace laughed softly. I thought I was early. You were. He pointed toward the front steps. I just wanted to check something before everyone arrived. Grace walked over. What are you measuring? Daniel stood and stepped aside. The entrance. She looked around. It seems fine. For most people, yes. He handed her the clipboard. I'm thinking about adding another handrail. Grace studied the sketch. There are already stairs. I know. He paused. But yesterday I noticed one of our volunteers helping a little boy with leg braces climb them. Grace remembered the child. He couldn't have been older than 9. It took him nearly 2 minutes to reach the door. Daniel continued. If we can make something easier for one child, we should. Grace looked back at the entrance. She hadn't even noticed. Daniel had. Not because someone complained, because he had been paying attention. She smiled. I think that's a wonderful idea. He nodded. So do I. Later that morning, the volunteers gathered inside the reading room. The temporary bookshelves had arrived, and everyone began unpacking boxes filled with donated novels, children's picture books, dictionaries, puzzles, and educational games. Grace carefully sorted books by age group. Daniel carried shelves into position. Occasionally, one of the volunteers asked where something belonged. Without fail, Daniel answered patiently. Never rushed, never irritated. When one teenage volunteer accidentally dropped an entire box of books across the floor, his face turned bright red. I'm so sorry. Daniel immediately knelt beside him. No harm done. I made a mess. Then we'll clean it together. Within seconds, several other volunteers joined them. Grace noticed something. Nobody looked afraid of making mistakes around Daniel. That wasn't an accident. It was leadership. Real leadership made people feel safe enough to learn. Around lunchtime, Lisa walked into the room carrying several envelopes. I have assignments for next week's mentoring program. She handed one to Grace. You'll be working with our middle school students. Grace smiled. I'd love that. Lisa handed another envelope to Daniel. And you'll supervise the after-school STEM workshop. Daniel nodded. Sounds good. Lisa looked between them. Actually. She grinned. I've been thinking. Grace immediately recognized that expression. What? I'd like the two of you to work together. Daniel raised an eyebrow. On what? Lisa unfolded a colorful flyer. Our summer reading challenge. Grace looked interested. We've been trying to encourage kids to read more during vacation. Daniel added, but attendance drops every year. Exactly, Lisa replied. I need someone who understands children. She looked at Grace. And someone who understands planning and logistics. She looked at Daniel. I think together you can create something special. Grace smiled politely. I'm willing. Daniel nodded. So am I. Lisa clapped her hands. Perfect. That afternoon, they spread notebooks across a folding table. Grace began brainstorming activities. What if every child earned points for reading? Daniel nodded. Good. And instead of prizes based only on who reads the most. She continued. We reward consistency. Daniel looked up. What do you mean? A child who reads 15 minutes every day should feel just as successful as someone who finishes 5 novels in a week. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I like that. Grace smiled. Really? You're rewarding habits instead of competition. She laughed. I've always believed small daily choices matter more than occasional big efforts. Daniel thought about that. My grandfather used to say something similar. What? Character isn't built on your best day, it's built on your ordinary ones. Grace wrote the quote in the corner of her notebook. I like your grandfather. Daniel smiled. So did everyone else. As the afternoon wore on, they disagreed several times. Grace wanted more reading circles. Daniel worried about scheduling. Daniel suggested larger group activities. Grace thought quieter children might feel overlooked. But every disagreement followed the same pattern. One explained, the other listened. Then they found a better solution together. Neither tried to win. The goal wasn't to prove who was smarter. It was to create something that genuinely helped the children. Grace realized how refreshing that felt. She didn't have to defend every opinion. She simply had to contribute. Near the end of the day, volunteers gathered outside for a short break. A little girl named Emma approached carrying a stack of coloring pages. She couldn't have been older than 7. "Mr. Daniel?" He looked down. "Yes?" "My picture ripped." She held up the torn paper with tears in her eyes. Daniel crouched until they were at eye level. "Oh." He examined it carefully. "This happens sometimes. I messed it up." He smiled gently. "No." He shook his head. "The paper tore." She looked confused. "There's a difference." Grace watched quietly. Daniel continued. "When people make mistakes, we fix them." He reached into a nearby folder and pulled out another coloring page. "When paper tears." He handed her the new sheet. "We simply start again." Emma smiled. "Thank you." She skipped away happily. Grace couldn't stop smiling. "You're good with kids." Daniel shrugged. "They deserve patience. So do adults." He looked at her. "Sometimes." She laughed. As everyone packed up for the day, Grace slipped her notebook into her bag. Without thinking, she reached for a heavy storage bin. Before she could lift it, Daniel spoke. "Wait." She looked at him. "That one's heavier than it looks." "I can manage." "I know." He smiled politely. "But you don't have to carry everything alone." The sentence caught her off guard, because it wasn't really about the storage bin. For years, she had quietly carried emotional responsibilities, remembering birthdays, planning holidays, keeping peace during disagreements, supporting Ethan whenever work overwhelmed him. Somewhere along the way, carrying everything had become normal. Daniel wasn't treating her like she was weak. He was simply offering to share the weight. She stepped aside. "Thank you." He lifted the container effortlessly. As they walked toward the storage room, Daniel asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What made you become a school counselor?" Grace thought for a moment. "When I was 12. She smiled softly. "I had a teacher who noticed I was struggling after my dad passed away." Daniel listened without interrupting. "She never tried to fix everything." Grace continued. "She just kept showing up." She looked down the hallway. "Sometimes people don't need someone to solve their problems. They just need someone who refuses to leave." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand that." Grace noticed something in his expression. A quiet sadness. Not fresh, not overwhelming, but familiar. "You've experienced that too." It wasn't a question. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he answered. "My wife used to say almost the same thing." Grace stopped walking. His wife? He looked toward the window before continuing. She believed consistency was another way of saying, "I love you." Grace suddenly understood. The wedding ring he no longer wore. The gentle sadness behind his smile. The patience that seemed deeper than personality alone. Daniel wasn't simply kind. He had known loss. Real loss. He offered a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "I don't usually talk about her." Grace shook her head gently. "You don't have to apologize." He nodded. "Maybe someday I'll tell you the whole story." Grace smiled kindly. "I'll listen when you're ready." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Not because he was falling in love. Not because of instant chemistry. But because, for the first time in years, he had met someone who understood that listening could be one of the greatest acts of kindness. As Grace walked toward her car that evening, she glanced back at the youth center. Only 3 days earlier, she had believed her future had collapsed. Now she realized something unexpected. Sometimes life closes one door quietly, because it's preparing you to notice another one you would have walked past before. By the end of the week, the Madison Community Youth Center had begun to change. Fresh paint-covered walls that had once looked neglected. New books filled the reading room shelves. Parents who had driven past the building for years without noticing it now slowed their cars to see what was happening. But the greatest transformation wasn't inside the building. It was happening quietly within Grace. For the first time in months, she woke each morning with somewhere she genuinely wanted to be. Not because it distracted her from her postponed wedding. Because it reminded her that life still had purpose beyond heartbreak. Friday morning began with rain. A steady drizzle covered the parking lot as volunteers hurried inside carrying supplies. Grace arrived balancing 2 trays of coffee and a box of fresh muffins. Lisa smiled as she opened the door. I think you've already become everyone's favorite volunteer. Grace laughed. I just figured coffee solves half of life's problems. Daniel, who was helping unload lumber from a delivery truck, overheard her. The other half? Grace grinned. People who actually listen. Daniel chuckled. I'll remember that. Inside, everyone gathered around the conference table to review the day's schedule. We've made great progress, Lisa began. But today we have one important decision left. She unrolled a large floor plan of the children's reading room. The city approved funding for one additional space. She pointed toward an empty corner. We can either install another row of bookshelves, then she pointed to another section, or create a quiet room where children can read, calm down, or speak privately with counselors. Several volunteers immediately favored more bookshelves. More books mean more learning. Another nodded. We're running out of storage already. Lisa looked toward Grace. What do you think? Grace studied the drawing. I think children remember how a place makes them feel more than how many books it holds. The room became quiet. She continued. As a counselor, I've learned that some children don't need another shelf. They need one peaceful corner where they feel safe. Daniel looked down at the blueprint. Without saying anything, he erased the extra bookshelves from his sketch. Then he began drawing a smaller room beside the reading area. One volunteer frowned. You changed the plan already? Daniel looked up. Because she's right. The man blinked. You agreed that quickly? Daniel smiled. I didn't agree because Grace suggested it. He tapped the blueprint. I agreed because it's the better idea. Grace looked at him for a moment. She wasn't used to that. With Ethan, every disagreement had felt like a debate. With Daniel, ideas weren't competitions. They were simply problems waiting for the best solution. Later that morning, Grace and Daniel drove to a nearby home improvement store to pick up supplies for the reading room. Lisa handed Daniel the shopping list. You two make a good team. Daniel smiled politely. We'll be back in an hour. The drive was comfortable. Neither of them felt pressure to fill every moment with conversation. Grace noticed Daniel humming softly to the old jazz station playing through the truck speakers. You like jazz? My wife loved it. He answered so naturally that Grace almost forgot this was the first time he'd mentioned her since the previous afternoon. I'm sorry. Daniel glanced at her briefly. For what? I didn't mean to bring up something painful. He smiled gently. You didn't. There was no sadness in his voice, only honesty. It's part of my life. Grace nodded. I understand. After another few moments of silence, Daniel spoke again. Emily used to say road trips weren't complete without bad coffee and good music. Grace smiled. Was she right? Always. He laughed softly. She had a way of making ordinary days feel important. Grace looked out the passenger window. She sounds wonderful. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded. She was. On the drive back, rain continued falling steadily against the windshield. Grace hesitated before asking, If you don't mind me asking. Daniel looked over briefly. What happened? He kept his eyes on the road. 3 years ago. His voice remained calm. Emily was driving home after volunteering at the food bank. Grace listened quietly. A driver crossed the center line during a snowstorm. He paused. She never made it to the hospital. Silence filled the truck. Grace didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. After nearly a minute, Daniel smiled faintly. Most people rush to fill silence. Grace looked at him. I've learned silence can be respectful. He nodded. Emily believed that too. When they returned to the youth center, volunteers quickly unloaded the supplies. Grace noticed Daniel greeting everyone exactly as he always did. Patient, kind, steady. He wasn't pretending nothing had happened. He had simply learned to carry grief without letting it harden his heart. That realization stayed with Grace all afternoon. Loss hadn't made him cynical. It had made him more compassionate. Around 3 o'clock, a group of middle school students arrived for an early mentoring session. One boy sat alone in the corner. His hood covered most of his face. He ignored everyone who tried speaking to him. Lisa quietly walked over to Grace. That's Marcus. Grace nodded. First day? Lisa sighed. His parents divorced last month. Grace immediately recognized the guarded posture. She had seen it many times at school. She didn't approach him right away. Instead, she sat at a nearby table and began organizing puzzle pieces. Several minutes passed. Eventually, Marcus looked up. What are you doing? Grace smiled. Trying to figure out why this puzzle has 2 extra pieces. He frowned. That's impossible. I thought so too. Curiosity slowly overcame his reluctance. Within minutes, Marcus walked over. Daniel watched from across the room while assembling a bookshelf. He smiled quietly. Grace hadn't forced a conversation. She had simply created a reason for one to happen. That was a gift. As the mentoring session ended, Marcus surprised everyone. He stopped beside Grace. "Will you be here Monday?" "I will." He nodded awkwardly. "Okay." Then he hurried toward the exit. Lisa walked over smiling. He hasn't voluntarily spoken to anyone all week. Grace watched Marcus leave. Sometimes, people don't need someone to ask 100 questions. They just need someone patient enough to wait. Daniel overheard her. "So, your teacher passed that lesson on?" Grace smiled. "I've tried to." Daniel looked thoughtfully at Marcus climbing into his mother's car. "You know," he said quietly, "I think this community center is helping more people than just the kids." Grace looked at him. "What do you mean?" He smiled. "I think it's helping us remember who we are." Grace felt those words settle deep within her heart. Because he was right. She had come to the youth center hoping to escape the pain of a broken future. Instead, she was rediscovering the woman she had been before she allowed someone else's opinion to define her worth. And that, she realized, was the beginning of real healing. The following Monday began with clear skies and cool summer air. By 8 o'clock, the parking lot of the Madison Community Youth Center was already filling with volunteers, parents, and children arriving for the first official week of the summer mentoring program. The building looked different now. Fresh flowers lined the entrance. The new handrail Daniel had insisted on installing gleamed in the morning sunlight. The reading room windows reflected bright blue skies instead of peeling paint. But what made Grace smile most wasn't the renovation. It was watching children run toward the front doors instead of dragging their feet. They were excited to be there. That alone made every hour of volunteer work worthwhile. As Grace unlocked the reading room, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Looks like we survived week 1. She turned. Daniel balanced 2 cardboard trays of coffee. "I figured coffee solves half of life's problems." Grace laughed. "You're remembering. I pay attention." He handed her a cup. "No cream. 1 packet of sugar." She looked at him, surprised. "You remembered that too?" Daniel shrugged. "You've ordered the same thing every morning." Grace smiled. Most people thought being noticed required grand romantic gestures. Sometimes it was as simple as someone remembering how you took your coffee. The children arrived in waves. Some rushed straight to the bookshelves. Others headed for the art tables. Marcus quietly walked through the door carrying a backpack nearly as large as he was. When he saw Grace, he gave a small wave. Not dramatic, not overly enthusiastic, just enough to show he felt comfortable. Grace waved back. She considered that a victory. Around mid-morning, Lisa gathered the volunteers. "I have exciting news." Everyone looked up. The city approved funding for a neighborhood family fair at the end of the summer. Several volunteers applauded. Lisa continued. "We'll celebrate the renovation, the mentoring program, and raise money to keep these activities running." She looked around the room. "I'll need someone to coordinate the event." Immediately, several people avoided eye contact. Organizing an event for hundreds of people was no small task. Lisa smiled. "I was hoping Grace would consider leading it." Grace blinked. "Me? You've organized school events before." "Yes, but..." Lisa wasn't finished. "And I'd like Daniel to manage the logistics." Daniel looked up from his clipboard. "I can do that." Lisa clapped her hands. "Wonderful." Grace laughed nervously. "I don't think I actually agreed." Daniel smiled. "I think she volunteered us before asking." Lisa grinned unapologetically. "I absolutely did." The room filled with laughter. For the first time in weeks, Grace laughed without forcing it. They spent the afternoon discussing ideas, reading stations, face painting, local food vendors, a used book fundraiser, children's science demonstrations, community music performances. Every suggestion built on the last. When disagreements arose, they solved them the same way they always had, with curiosity instead of pride. At one point, Daniel suggested renting an expensive stage. Grace frowned thoughtfully. "What if we use the amphitheater in the city park instead?" Daniel studied the map. "It's free." She nodded. "And families already know where it is." Daniel smiled. "There goes another one of my expensive ideas." Grace laughed. "I'm not keeping score." "Neither am I." He crossed the stage off the budget. "That's why this works." During lunch, several volunteers sat beneath the maple trees. Grace noticed Daniel staring toward the playground. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Just remembering." She waited. "My wife loved community events." Grace remained silent. He smiled faintly. She believed neighbors became stronger when they actually knew each other. Grace looked around. Children from different schools were already playing together. Parents who had never met before were sharing picnic tables. Emily had been right. Community wasn't built by buildings. It was built by people. That afternoon, Ethan sat in the waiting room of a therapist's office. He checked the clock for the third time. Part of him wanted to leave. He had never spoken to a therapist before. Growing up, his family handled problems differently. Work harder. Move forward. Don't dwell on mistakes. But none of those habits had repaired the damage he'd caused. The receptionist smiled. "Mr. Brooks?" He stood. "Dr. Alison Grant will see you now." The office felt surprisingly ordinary. Bookshelves, comfortable chairs, family photographs, nothing intimidating. Dr. Grant welcomed him warmly. "What brings you here?" Ethan hesitated. "I hurt someone I love." She nodded. "What happened?" "I made a joke." "And?" "It wasn't funny." She waited. He appreciated that she wasn't rushing him. "It wasn't just the joke," he admitted quietly. "It made her question whether I respected her." "Doctor." Grant leaned forward slightly. "What do you think?" He looked down. "I think—" He stopped. For several moments, he couldn't continue. Finally he whispered, "I think she's right." The words felt painfully honest. Dr. Grant didn't criticize him. She simply asked, "When did you first learn that humor was the safest way to express uncomfortable feelings?" Ethan frowned. "I don't know. Think about your childhood." He leaned back slowly. His father, family dinners, every serious conversation ended with sarcasm. Embarrassment became entertainment. Vulnerability became something to laugh away before someone else could. He had never questioned it. Until now. Back at the youth center, Grace and Daniel finished organizing donations. As they locked the storage room, Grace noticed Daniel struggling slightly while lifting a heavy box. "You okay?" He smiled. "I'm fine." She folded her arms. "That's not a real answer." He laughed. "My shoulder's a little sore." "Then let me help." "I've got it." Grace gently reached for one side of the box anyway. "Remember what you told me?" Daniel looked confused. "You said I didn't have to carry everything alone." He smiled. "I did say that." "So, neither do you." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel nodded. "Fair enough." Together, they carried the box the rest of the way. Neither spoke. The moment didn't need words. Mutual support often looked ordinary from the outside. But it was built one small decision at a time. Before leaving for the evening, Lisa handed Grace a folder. "What's this?" "Applications." Grace opened it. "For volunteer mentors?" Lisa nodded. "We've had almost 40 new people sign up since the renovation started." Grace looked surprised. 40? People noticed. Lisa smiled proudly. They saw what this community became. Grace looked around the building. Fresh paint, happy children, dedicated volunteers, kind conversations, healing, not just for the neighborhood. As Grace walked toward her car, Daniel caught up with her. "I wanted to ask you something." She stopped. "Sure. The family fair." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I was thinking maybe we could visit the city park tomorrow." "To plan the layout?" He nodded. "And maybe get lunch afterward." Grace looked at him. For one brief second, her heart became cautious. Not because she thought Daniel was asking for a date, but because she suddenly realized how easily people could misunderstand simple kindness. Daniel seemed to recognize her hesitation immediately. He smiled reassuringly. "Only if you're comfortable. No pressure. We'll mostly be measuring booth locations." Grace laughed. "You really know how to make lunch sound like construction work." "I am an engineer." "I noticed." She smiled. "I'd like that." Daniel returned her smile. "Great." As he walked toward his truck, Grace stood beside her car for another moment. She realized something important. Healing wasn't about finding someone new as quickly as possible. It was about becoming healthy enough that when good people entered your life, you could recognize them for who they truly were. Not as replacements, but as individuals deserving to be known. And somewhere across town, Ethan sat in his car outside the therapist's office, staring through the windshield. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to convince Grace to come back. He was thinking about the man he needed to become, even if she never did. Both of them were changing, separately, slowly, and for the first time in a long while, their choices were being guided, not by fear, but by honesty. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of sunshine that made Madison feel almost weightless. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and the city park where the summer family fair would be held was already alive with joggers, dog walkers, and parents pushing strollers along the winding paths. Grace parked near the amphitheater just before 9 o'clock. Daniel's pickup truck was already there. She smiled to herself. He's early again. She grabbed her notebook, a reusable water bottle, and the folder Lisa had given her before walking toward the park entrance. Daniel was standing near the amphitheater, studying a printed map clipped to a clipboard. When he noticed her, he folded the map and smiled. "Good morning." "Morning. You found the place." Grace laughed. "You gave very detailed directions. I may have included too many landmarks." "You definitely did." He smiled sheepishly. Occupational hazard. They spent the next hour walking the park. Daniel measured open spaces, while Grace imagined how families would move through the event. "What if we placed the children's reading tent under those oak trees?" Grace suggested. Daniel followed her gaze. "Less direct sunlight. And parents can watch from nearby benches." He nodded. "Good thinking." A few minutes later, Daniel pointed toward a paved walkway. "Food vendors should stay here." Grace looked confused. "Not closer to the stage?" He shook his head. "If families have to cross children's activity areas carrying hot food, accidents become more likely." Grace smiled. "I never would have thought of that." Daniel shrugged. "That's why we're working together." Neither of them expected the other to know everything. They simply respected what each person brought to the table. Around 11 o'clock, they stopped near a small duck pond. Grace sat on a wooden bench while Daniel reviewed measurements. "You know," she said, "I used to think compatibility meant agreeing about everything." Daniel looked up. "I don't. No? I think compatibility means disagreeing well." Grace considered that. "My grandparents argued all the time." He smiled. "But they respected each other." "Exactly." He folded the map. "My grandfather once told me something I'll never forget." "What was it?" "The strongest bridges aren't built because every piece is identical." He pointed toward a pedestrian bridge spanning the pond. "They're strong because every part supports the others." Grace watched the water ripple beneath the bridge. "I like that. It changed how I looked at relationships." She quietly added the quote to her notebook. When lunchtime arrived, they walked to a small cafe overlooking the park. Nothing fancy. A family-owned place with homemade soup, sandwiches and pie displayed behind a glass counter. Daniel held the door open. After ordering, they found a quiet table near the window. For a while, conversation stayed focused on the community fair. Then Grace looked out the window and smiled. "I used to love places like this." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Used to?" She laughed softly. "Ethan always preferred upscale restaurants." "You didn't?" "I enjoyed them." She paused. "But sometimes, I just wanted somewhere people weren't afraid to laugh too loudly." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "My wife loved diners." Grace smiled. "Really?" She believed the best conversations happened over ordinary food. He glanced around the cafe. I think she was right. As they ate, an elderly waitress accidentally bumped Daniel's glass of iced tea. The drink spilled across the table. "Oh my goodness." The waitress looked horrified. "I'm so sorry." Without hesitation, Daniel stood. "It's okay." He grabbed napkins. "No one got hurt. I'll replace your meal." "You don't need to." "But it was my fault." Daniel smiled kindly. "Accidents happen." The waitress visibly relaxed. Grace watched the entire interaction. No irritation, no sarcastic comments, no attempt to embarrass someone who had made an honest mistake. Just patience. After the waitress walked away, Grace smiled. "You handled that well." Daniel looked confused. "Handled what?" "The spill." He shrugged. She already felt bad. There wasn't any reason to make her feel worse. Grace looked down at her coffee. She remembered another restaurant. Nearly a year earlier, a server had accidentally forgotten Ethan's appetizer. He hadn't yelled, but he'd spent the rest of the evening making little jokes about professionalism. The waitress had apologized 4 times. By the end of dinner, she'd looked close to tears. Grace had told herself Ethan wasn't being cruel, just frustrated. Now she wondered how many moments she had explained away because she loved him. On the drive back to the youth center, Grace found herself unusually quiet. Daniel noticed. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking." "About the event?" She looked out the window. "About patterns." He didn't interrupt. "I've been remembering things differently lately." Daniel waited. "I used to judge relationships by the big moments. The proposal. The vacations. The anniversaries." She smiled sadly. "But now I think the ordinary moments tell the real story." Daniel nodded. "They usually do. How someone treats waiters. Whether they keep small promises. Whether they listen. Whether they apologize." He smiled. "My grandfather would have agreed." Grace laughed. "I'm beginning to think your grandfather was a wise man." He was. Back at the youth center, Marcus was waiting by the entrance. He looked nervous. "Miss Grace?" "Hi, Marcus." He shuffled awkwardly. "I finished the first book." Grace's face lit up. "You did?" He pulled a paperback from his backpack. "I liked it." "What was your favorite part?" Marcus spent the next 5 minutes excitedly describing the story. Daniel walked past carrying lumber, but slowed when he saw the conversation. He smiled quietly before continuing his work. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush either of them. Later that afternoon, Grace found him installing shelves. "You noticed Marcus?" Daniel nodded. "He smiled today." "He did. I don't think that's because of the books." Grace looked at him. "It's because someone kept showing up." Grace thought about that. Children noticed consistency long before they trusted words. Maybe adults did too. As volunteers finished for the day, Lisa gathered everyone together. "I have wonderful news." Everyone looked up. A local business has offered to sponsor the family fair. Applause filled the room. "But," Lisa continued, "they'd like someone to give a short speech about why this project matters." She smiled toward Grace. "I immediately thought of you." Grace's eyes widened. "Me? You connect with people." Grace laughed nervously. "I talk to fourth graders for a living. They're usually the toughest audience." Even Daniel laughed at that. Lisa handed Grace a folder. "You have 2 weeks." Grace looked down at the papers. Public speaking had never frightened her, but speaking from the heart often did. As everyone began packing up, Daniel walked beside her toward the parking lot. "I think you'll do great." Grace smiled uncertainly. "I hope so. You know why people listen to you?" She shook her head. "Because they can tell you believe what you're saying." Grace looked at him for a long moment. That encouragement meant more than he probably realized. He wasn't praising her to impress her. He genuinely believed in her abilities. There was a difference. One built confidence. The other built dependence. She finally understood which one healthy relationships required. As she drove home that evening, she glanced at the empty passenger seat beside her. For the first time since postponing the wedding, she realized she had gone an entire day without replaying Ethan's words. Healing wasn't happening all at once. It was happening one ordinary moment at a time. And those ordinary moments were quietly becoming something extraordinary. The following Saturday arrived faster than anyone expected. For nearly 2 weeks, volunteers had worked tirelessly preparing for the Madison Community Youth Center's first community family fair in almost 5 years. Tables were stacked neatly beneath white tents. Children's artwork decorated fences surrounding the playground. The reading challenge banners Grace and Daniel had designed together fluttered gently in the morning breeze. By 8 o'clock, volunteers were already unloading books, games, science kits, and boxes of donated school supplies. Grace stood near the registration booth, reviewing the final checklist. Information table. She marked it. Complete. First aid station. Complete. Reading tent. Complete. A familiar voice interrupted her concentration. "You're checking the checklist again." Grace looked up. Daniel stood beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I've only checked it 3 times. He smiled. "Only?" She accepted the coffee. "Fine." She laughed. 4. Daniel looked around at the organized booths. "You've done an incredible job." "We've done an incredible job." He nodded. "Fair enough." Neither tried to take credit. That had become one of the things Grace appreciated most about working with him. Success wasn't something he needed to own. He was simply happy to see it happen. By 10 o'clock, families began arriving. Children rushed toward the face-painting station. Parents gathered around local vendors. Volunteers welcomed everyone with warm smiles. The reading tent quickly filled with young readers listening to community members read aloud. Marcus arrived with his mother. Instead of hiding behind her like he had during his first week at the youth center, he walked confidently toward Grace. "Miss Grace." She smiled. "Good morning. I finished 3 books." He proudly handed her his reading log. Grace looked at the pages. Every day had been filled in. "I am so proud of you." Marcus grinned. "My mom says I've been reading after dinner every night." His mother smiled. I haven't had to remind him once. Grace handed Marcus a small bookmark printed with the words, "Every page you read builds a stronger future." Marcus held it like it was a trophy. As he ran toward the reading tent, Daniel quietly stepped beside Grace. "You didn't just teach him to read." Grace looked at Marcus laughing with other children. "No. You helped him believe he could." She swallowed the emotion rising in her throat. Sometimes people never realized how much one encouraging adult could change a child's life. Near noon, Grace finally stepped onto the small amphitheater stage to deliver the welcome speech Lisa had asked her to prepare. Hundreds of families filled the park. She took a slow breath, then smiled. "Good afternoon, everyone." The conversations gradually quieted. When people look around today, they see books. And she gestured toward the reading tent. They see games. She pointed toward the children's activities. They see volunteers. She smiled at the dozens of people wearing blue community shirts. "But I hope you also see something else." She paused. "You are looking at what happens when ordinary people decide that someone else's future matters." The audience listened attentively. This community center wasn't rebuilt by one person. It was rebuilt one choice at a time. One volunteer, one donated book, 1 hour after work, one encouraging conversation. She looked toward the children gathered beneath the oak trees. Every child deserves at least one adult who believes in them. And every community becomes stronger when neighbors choose to invest in one another instead of waiting for someone else to do it. Applause spread through the crowd. Grace smiled, not because they were applauding her, because they were applauding an idea she deeply believed. When she stepped off the stage, Lisa hugged her tightly. "That was beautiful." Grace laughed. "I was terrified. No one could tell." Daniel walked over. "I could." Grace looked surprised. "You could?" He smiled. "But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing while you're afraid." She stared at him. Sometimes Daniel had a way of saying exactly what someone needed to hear. The afternoon passed quickly. Children painted murals. Teenagers participated in engineering demonstrations Daniel had organized. Parents visited booths offering literacy resources and family counseling information. Grace watched volunteers laughing together. Neighbors who had never spoken before exchanged phone numbers. The fair had become far more than a fundraiser. It had become a reminder that healthy communities were built through relationships. Late in the afternoon, Grace noticed an elderly man sitting alone near the edge of the park. His walker rested beside the bench. He seemed to be struggling with a paper plate balanced on his lap. Before Grace could move, Daniel quietly walked over. Without drawing attention to himself, he knelt beside the man. He adjusted the plate so it wouldn't slide. Then, he carried over a bottle of water and sat for several minutes simply talking with him. No one had asked him to. There were no cameras, no applause, no audience. Just one man noticing another person's need. Grace watched from a distance. She remembered something her father used to say. "Character is what you do when no one is keeping score." Daniel had no idea she was watching, which somehow made the moment even more meaningful. As sunset approached, volunteers began cleaning the park. Grace and Daniel collected empty boxes and folded tables together. Lisa walked over carrying an envelope. "I almost forgot." She handed it to Grace. "What's this?" The city approved a small community leadership award. Grace opened the envelope. Inside was a certificate recognizing the volunteer team. Her name appeared first, Daniel second. Grace looked up. "This should have both our names equally." Lisa smiled. "I know, but the city listed project coordinators alphabetically." Grace laughed with relief. "For a second, I thought you were playing favorites." Daniel grinned. "I was already preparing a speech about fairness." The three of them laughed. As darkness settled over the park, the final volunteers headed home. Only Grace and Daniel remained near the amphitheater, loading the last folding chairs into a storage trailer. Grace leaned against the truck, exhausted. "I forgot how tiring happiness can be." Daniel smiled. "Good tired? The best kind." For a moment, they simply watched the nearly empty park. Children's laughter still echoed faintly in the distance. Then Daniel spoke quietly. "You know." Grace looked at him. "I've been thinking about something." She waited. "When Emily passed away." He looked toward the fading sunset. "I convinced myself that loving someone again would somehow mean I was leaving part of her behind." Grace remained silent. "But today," he smiled gently, "I realized that's not how love works." She didn't interrupt. Someone who truly loves you would never want grief to become your permanent address. Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes. Not from sadness, from understanding. She knew he wasn't confessing romantic feelings. He was sharing a truth he had spent years discovering, and trusting her enough to say it aloud. She answered softly, "I think the people we lose leave us hoping we'll keep choosing life." Daniel nodded. "I think so too." Their conversation was interrupted by the vibration of Grace's phone. She glanced at the screen. Ethan Brooks. She stared at the name for several seconds. Daniel noticed the expression on her face, but didn't look at the phone. Instead, he simply asked, "Everything okay?" Grace took a slow breath. "I don't know." The phone stopped ringing. A moment later, a text message appeared. "Grace, I know I have no right to ask this, but could we meet one last time? There are things I finally understand that I should have understood long ago. Grace looked at the message in silence. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. The past was asking for one final conversation. The future stood quietly beside her, offering no pressure, no expectations, only respect. For the first time, she realized that deciding what to do next wouldn't be about choosing between two men. It would be about choosing the kind of life she wanted to live. Before we continue, take a moment to think about Grace's journey. She didn't heal because someone new came into her life. She began healing the moment she chose to respect herself, set healthy boundaries, and surround herself with people who valued her actions, her voice, and her heart. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Do you believe people can truly change after they've hurt someone, or do some choices have consequences that can't be undone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story or perspective might encourage someone who's facing a difficult decision in their own life. If you're enjoying this story and want more heartfelt American love stories filled with real-life lessons about trust, respect, forgiveness, and second chances, please like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family. Now, let's continue, because Grace is about to face the conversation she's been avoiding, and the choice she makes will shape the rest of her life. Grace didn't answer Ethan's text that night, not because she wanted to punish him, not because she wanted him to wonder. She simply understood something she hadn't understood a month earlier. Not every message required an immediate response. Some decisions deserve time. She slipped her phone into her purse, wished Daniel good night, and drove home beneath a sky filled with stars. The silence inside her car felt different now. Weeks ago, silence had been filled with questions. Now it was filled with reflection. She wasn't trying to decide whether Ethan was a bad man. She had stopped asking that. The question had become much simpler. Was he the right man for the life she wanted to build? Those weren't the same question, and realizing the difference changed everything. The next morning, Grace woke before her alarm. She opened the curtains and watched the sunrise paint soft shades of orange across the neighborhood. For years, mornings had started with checking emails, reviewing schedules, or reminding Ethan about appointments they shared. Today she brewed coffee, opened her journal, and wrote one sentence across the top of a blank page. What kind of marriage would allow me to become the best version of myself? She stared at the question for several minutes. Then she began writing. She wanted honesty. She wanted peace. She wanted laughter that never came at someone else's expense. She wanted disagreements where both people listened before speaking. She wanted someone who celebrated her strengths instead of turning them into punchlines. She wanted a home where kindness wasn't saved for strangers. By the time she reached the bottom of the page, she realized something. She hadn't written a single sentence about money. Not one about appearance. Not one about status. Everything she valued had to do with character. She closed the journal gently. Maybe she had finally learned the lesson life had been trying to teach her. Around 10 o'clock, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Ethan. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking for one conversation. If you still say goodbye afterward, I'll respect it. Grace read the message twice. Then she called Vanessa. Her sister answered immediately. Morning? Can I ask you something? Always. Ethan wants to meet. Vanessa remained quiet. What do you think? Grace asked. I think you're asking the wrong person. Grace smiled. I probably am. What do you want? Grace looked out the window. I don't know. Vanessa spoke gently. Then don't meet him because you feel guilty. Meet him only if you believe the conversation will help you move forward. Grace thought about that. Move forward, not backward, not in circles. Forward. I think I need closure. Vanessa answered softly, then get closure. But don't confuse closure with obligation. Grace spent the rest of the morning thinking about those words. By lunchtime, she picked up her phone. Okay. Tomorrow, at 4. Maple Street Cafe. One conversation. Within seconds, Ethan replied, Thank you. I'll be there. Nothing else. No pleading. No promises. No declarations of love. Grace appreciated that. The next afternoon, Maple Street Cafe was unusually quiet. The lunch crowd had already gone home. Only a few customers remained scattered around the small dining room. Grace arrived first. She chose a table near the window, not hidden, not overly private, simply comfortable. 5 minutes later, Ethan walked in. He looked thinner. The confident posture she had always associated with him had softened. When he saw her, he hesitated before approaching. Hi. Hi. He didn't try to hug her, didn't reach for her hand. He simply sat down. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan smiled weakly. You look well. Grace nodded politely. Thank you. You do too. He laughed quietly. I appreciate the kindness. A waitress arrived. They ordered coffee. When she walked away, the silence returned. This time, Ethan broke it. I've been seeing a therapist. Grace hadn't expected that. How long? 3 weeks. She nodded slowly. How's it going? He looked down at his cup. It's uncomfortable. She almost smiled. I imagine it is. He nodded. I've spent most of my life believing that, if people laughed. He paused. Then everything was okay. Grace listened. My therapist asked me where I learned that. And? He sighed. I realized I grew up watching every uncomfortable conversation become a joke. She remembered dinners with Ethan's family. His father teasing everyone relentlessly. His uncles turning embarrassment into entertainment. She had noticed it. She simply hadn't realized how deeply it had shaped him. Ethan continued. I wasn't trying to humiliate you. Grace answered quietly. I know. I really didn't think about how those words would make you feel. I know. He looked surprised. You do? I've never doubted that you loved me. She looked directly into his eyes. I doubted whether you understood what respect requires. His shoulders lowered. You're right. The waitress returned with coffee. Neither touched it. Ethan folded his hands together. I've been thinking about our relationship. Grace waited. I kept remembering all the things you did for me. The late nights. The presentations. The apartment. The wedding. He shook his head slowly. I accepted all of it. He swallowed hard. But I don't think I appreciated it. Grace remained silent. You gave without keeping score. I received without paying attention. The honesty in his voice surprised her. Not because it erased the past, but because it sounded like someone finally telling himself the truth. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. He placed the velvet ring box gently on the table. I've carried this every day. Grace looked at it. I wasn't hoping you'd take it back. He smiled sadly. I think I carried it because I needed to remember what careless words cost. Grace looked at the small box for several moments. Then she pushed it back toward him. I think you should keep it. He looked confused. Why? Because your lesson isn't finished. He nodded slowly. I understand. For nearly an hour they talked. Not about wedding dates, not about reconciliation. They talked about habits, family, communication, fear, immaturity, pride. At one point Ethan admitted something that caught Grace completely off guard. I always admired how organized you were. She smiled faintly. I know. No. He shook his head. I don't think you do. I teased you because I secretly depended on that part of you. Grace frowned. What do you mean? I was insecure. He laughed bitterly. You made life feel stable. I made jokes because admitting that felt vulnerable. Grace stared at him. That explanation didn't excuse anything, but it explained far more than she had expected. Eventually, Ethan leaned back in his chair. I've wanted to ask you something all afternoon. Grace nodded. Go ahead. Is there someone else? Grace looked at him quietly. She knew exactly why he was asking. You mean Daniel? Ethan's eyes widened. So there is someone. She smiled gently. There's someone I've become friends with. Nothing more? Grace answered honestly. I don't know what the future holds. She paused. But that's not why we're here. Ethan nodded. You're right. She continued. If Daniel had never entered my life. Yeah. She looked directly at him. I still would have postponed our wedding. Those words hurt. Not because they were cruel. Because they were true. This had never been about another man. It had always been about the relationship they had built together, and the respect it lacked. Ethan lowered his eyes. I needed to hear that. Grace nodded. I think you did. As they stood to leave, Ethan surprised her one last time. He smiled. Not happily, but peacefully. I've been hoping this conversation would convince you to come back. Grace waited. It didn't. He shook his head. It convinced me that I still have a lot of work to do. Grace smiled softly. I think we both do. He extended his hand. Not as a fiancé. Not even as someone expecting forgiveness. Simply as a man acknowledging another person's dignity. Grace looked at his hand for a brief moment. Then she shook it. I hope you become the man you're capable of being. Ethan nodded. And I hope you never settle for less than the respect you deserve. They walked out of the cafe in opposite directions. For the first time since the night of the party, neither of them looked back. Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on. It's having the courage to let someone continue growing, even if that journey no longer includes you. Grace expected to feel lighter after meeting Ethan. Instead, she felt thoughtful. The conversation hadn't repaired the past. It hadn't erased the hurt. But it had removed something she hadn't realized she was carrying: uncertainty. For weeks, she'd wondered if postponing the wedding had been an emotional reaction. Now she knew it had been a necessary decision. She drove home without tears, without anger, just with the quiet understanding that some chapters ended not because people stopped caring, but because they finally started telling the truth. The next morning, Grace arrived at the youth center earlier than usual. She unlocked the reading room and opened every window, letting the cool morning breeze drift through the building. The smell of fresh paint had finally disappeared. Children's artwork now covered the once empty walls. Books lined the shelves. The quiet room she had suggested had become one of the busiest spaces in the building. Several children already called it the Peace Corner. Grace smiled every time she heard that name. She hadn't planned it. The children had. Sometimes the people you hoped to help ended up teaching you something instead. Daniel arrived carrying a cardboard box. "Morning." "Good morning." He set the box on a table. "More books?" Grace asked. He smiled. "No." She opened the box. Inside were small beanbag chairs in bright colors: blue, green, yellow, a few shaped like oversized leaves. Grace laughed. "These are adorable. I figured the Peace Corner needed comfortable seating." She picked up one of the tags. "You bought these yourself?" Daniel shrugged. "They were on sale." Grace looked at him knowingly. "They weren't cheap." He smiled. "I've learned something over the years." "What?" "If children feel comfortable." He looked around the room. "They stay longer." Grace nodded. "And when they stay longer, they build trust." Daniel finished her sentence. They looked at each other for a moment before both laughing. "We're starting to finish each other's thoughts," Grace said. Daniel smiled. "That's probably a sign we've spent too much time organizing books." As they arranged the beanbag chairs, Marcus wandered into the reading room. He looked around with wide eyes. "Whoa!" Grace smiled. "What do you think?" He immediately sat on the bright blue chair. "This is awesome." Daniel folded his arms. "Approved?" Marcus gave a serious nod. "Definitely." Then he opened his latest library book without another word. Grace quietly whispered, "I think we have our first official customer." Daniel smiled. "And our toughest critic." Later that morning, Lisa gathered the volunteers for coffee. "I have an announcement." Everyone looked up. The city council visited the family fair. Several volunteers exchanged surprised looks. They loved what they saw. Applause filled the room. Lisa continued, "They've asked if we'd be willing to expand this mentoring program to another neighborhood next spring." More applause. Grace looked around the room. What had begun as a renovation project had become something much larger. Proof that one good decision often inspired another. After the meeting, Grace and Daniel stayed behind to organize paperwork. Daniel noticed she seemed unusually quiet. "You've been thinking." Grace smiled. "Is it that obvious? You tap your pen against the table whenever you're sorting something out." She laughed. "I didn't know I did that." "You do." She looked at the pen in her hand. He was right. "I met Ethan yesterday." Daniel paused only briefly. Then he nodded. "How did it go?" Grace appreciated that he hadn't immediately asked for details. He simply gave her space. "It went better than I expected." "I'm glad." He apologized. Daniel remained silent. "He meant it." "I believe that." Grace looked at him. "You do?" He nodded. "People can be sincerely sorry." She waited. "But—" He smiled gently. "Being sorry and rebuilding trust aren't always the same journey." Grace stared at him for several seconds. That single sentence captured everything she had struggled to explain to friends and family. "Exactly." She exhaled slowly. "That's exactly how I feel." Daniel nodded. "I'm happy the conversation brought you peace." He didn't ask whether she planned to reconcile. He didn't offer advice. He didn't criticize Ethan. He simply respected her ability to make her own decisions. Grace noticed that. Healthy people, she realized, didn't try to control other people's choices. That afternoon, the volunteers worked outside planting flowers near the entrance. Grace knelt beside Daniel, carefully placing purple coneflowers into freshly turned soil. After a while, Daniel spoke. "My grandfather planted flowers every spring." Grace smiled. "I've heard a lot about your grandfather." He laughed. "He raised me after my parents divorced." "He sounds like an incredible man." He was." Daniel carefully pressed soil around one of the plants. "He used to tell me." He paused. "That flowers teach patience." Grace looked curious. How? You can't pull on a flower to make it bloom faster. She smiled. You'll only damage it. He nodded. People are similar. Grace quietly looked at the flower she had just planted. Healing, trust, forgiveness, growth, none of them could be rushed. Trying to force them usually caused more harm. By late afternoon, the last volunteers headed home. Grace stayed behind to finish filing student reading logs. The building had become almost silent. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Daniel appeared carrying 2 cups of tea. I guessed you might still be here. Grace smiled. You guessed right. He handed her 1 cup. They sat together in the reading room. Sunlight poured through the large windows, casting warm patterns across the floor. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence felt comfortable. Finally, Grace broke it. Can I ask you something? Of course. Were you ever angry? Daniel looked out the window. After Emily died? Grace nodded. He took a slow breath. For a long time. At who? Myself, she frowned. Why? I kept thinking about everything I wished I'd said. Everything I wished I'd done. He smiled sadly. Grief has a way of convincing you that you could have controlled things you never actually could. Grace listened carefully. What changed? Daniel looked at the children's artwork hanging on the wall. One day, I realized something. What? If I kept living inside my regrets. He paused. I'd be wasting the life Emily wanted me to keep living. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. Not because his words were dramatic, because they were honest. Daniel continued quietly. Moving forward isn't the same as forgetting. It's choosing to honor the past without becoming trapped inside it. Grace whispered, I think I needed to hear that. As evening approached, they locked the building together. Walking toward the parking lot, Daniel suddenly stopped. I almost forgot. He reached into the back seat of his truck and pulled out a small paper bag. What's this? He handed it to Grace. Nothing fancy. She looked inside. A hardcover journal. The cover was simple navy blue with the words, Small Choices, Big Life. Grace looked up. It's beautiful. I saw it at a bookstore. He smiled. It reminded me of something you said. What? That ordinary moments tell the real story. Grace ran her fingers across the cover. No expensive gift. No grand romantic gesture. Just something thoughtful. Something personal. Something that showed he had listened. I can't accept this. Why not? It's too much. Daniel laughed. It cost less than lunch. She smiled. That's not what I meant. He understood. This isn't because I expect anything. He looked at her with calm sincerity. I simply thought you'd enjoy writing in it. Grace believed him, because his actions had always matched his words. She accepted the journal. Thank you. You're welcome. As Grace climbed into her car, she placed the journal carefully on the passenger seat. She looked at it for a long moment before starting the engine. For years, she had believed love was proven by extraordinary moments. A proposal, a vacation, a wedding. Now she was beginning to understand something much deeper. Sometimes love first reveals itself in ordinary kindness. Long before anyone ever says the words, Grace placed the navy blue journal on her bedside table that evening. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she changed into comfortable clothes, made herself a cup of chamomile tea, and stood on her apartment balcony watching the last light disappear behind the rooftops. For a long time, she simply listened. Children laughing somewhere down the street. A dog barking in the distance. Wind moving gently through the trees. Life had a way of continuing, even when people's plans changed. She used to resent that. Now she found it comforting. Before going to bed, she finally opened the journal. The first page was blank. She picked up a pen. For several minutes, she couldn't think of what to write. Then, slowly, the words came. Today I realized that peace feels unfamiliar when you've spent years confusing anxiety with commitment. She stopped writing and read the sentence again. It surprised her. She had spent so much of her relationship with Ethan trying to anticipate problems before they happened, remembering appointments, keeping schedules, avoiding disagreements, smoothing over awkward moments. She had mistaken constant emotional management for partnership. With Daniel, she never felt responsible for managing his emotions. He managed them himself. It was such a simple difference. Yet it changed everything. The next morning, the youth center buzzed with excitement. The summer reading challenge had become far more successful than anyone expected. Children lined up at the registration table before the doors even opened. Marcus proudly carried another completed reading log. Emma rushed inside, holding a chapter book nearly as thick as her arm. Miss Grace. Grace laughed. Good morning. I finished it. You finished all 300 pages? Emma nodded enthusiastically. My grandma helped me sound out the hard words. Grace smiled warmly. Then I think both of you deserve congratulations. Emma grinned before hurrying toward the prize table. Daniel watched the interaction while assembling a display stand nearby. You were right. Grace looked over. About what? Children don't need perfect programs. He smiled. They need adults who believe they can succeed. Grace laughed softly. I've had some excellent teachers. I can tell. Later that morning, Lisa entered carrying a folder. I have another favor to ask. Grace smiled. I should have known. Lisa laughed. It's a small one. Daniel looked skeptical. You always say that. She ignored him. A neighboring community center wants advice about starting their own mentoring program. Grace looked interested. That's wonderful. They've invited us to speak at their volunteer workshop next Thursday. She looked at both of them. I'd like you two to represent us. Grace hesitated. Together? Lisa nodded. You've become the heart of this project. Daniel immediately answered. I'm happy to. Grace looked uncertain. Public speaking didn't frighten her. Speaking alongside Daniel somehow did, not because she lacked confidence, because people had begun noticing how well they worked together. She wasn't sure she was ready for the assumptions that often followed. Lisa seemed to sense her hesitation. Only if you're comfortable. Grace smiled politely. That afternoon, they met in one of the classrooms to prepare the presentation. Daniel placed several notepads on the table. So, Ike, he smiled. How do we explain months of work in 30 minutes? Grace laughed. Very carefully. They began listing ideas, community partnerships, consistency, listening to families, creating safe spaces, encouraging volunteers. Halfway through, Daniel looked at the list. Something's missing. Grace frowned. What? The reason this worked. She looked confused. We've already listed the programs. I'm not talking about programs. He leaned back. I'm talking about people. Grace waited. No renovation succeeds because of paint. No reading challenge succeeds because of books. They succeed because people decide someone else matters. Grace smiled. I think that should be our opening. Daniel nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. As they continued working, Marcus knocked gently on the classroom door. Miss Grace? Come in. He stepped inside holding a folded piece of paper. I made something. Grace unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing. The youth center stood in the middle of the page. Children played outside. Flowers surrounded the entrance. Near the front doors were two stick figures. One had curly hair. The other wore a blue shirt. Across the top, Marcus had written in careful handwriting, "Thank you for making this place happy." Grace felt her throat tighten. It's beautiful. Marcus looked at Daniel. I drew you too. Daniel smiled. I noticed. Marcus scratched the back of his head. I couldn't draw your beard very good. Grace laughed. Daniel rubbed his chin. I think you captured it perfectly. Marcus smiled proudly before leaving the room. Grace looked back at the drawing. Do you realize what you've done? Daniel frowned. What we've done? She corrected gently. He feels safe here. Daniel looked at the picture for a long moment. I think that's the greatest compliment anyone could receive. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly. Before leaving, Lisa stopped Grace in the hallway. Can we talk? Of course. Lisa glanced toward the parking lot where Daniel was loading supplies into his truck. He's a good man. Grace smiled. He is. Lisa looked back at Grace. I hope you know I'm not trying to play matchmaker. Grace laughed. I figured. I'm simply old enough to recognize the difference between chemistry. She paused. And compatibility. Grace listened carefully. Chemistry gets people's attention. Lisa continued. Character keeps people together. Those words stayed with Grace long after the conversation ended. That evening, Grace visited her mother. Patricia was trimming roses in the backyard when Grace arrived. You look happier. Grace smiled. I feel lighter. They sat together on the porch with iced tea. After talking about work and the community center, Patricia looked at her daughter thoughtfully. Can I ask you something? Always. Have you forgiven Ethan? Grace thought for a moment. I think I have. Her mother nodded. And have you forgiven yourself? Grace blinked. For what? Patricia reached across the table. For ignoring your own feelings for so long. Grace looked down. She had never considered that. For years, she dismissed her discomfort. Excused disrespect. Convinced herself she was being too sensitive. Maybe she wasn't only grieving the relationship. Maybe she was grieving the version of herself who had believed she needed to earn respect. Tears quietly filled her eyes. I don't know. Her mother squeezed her hand gently. Driving home that night, Grace couldn't stop thinking about her mother's question. At a red light, she opened the journal Daniel had given her. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Forgiving others frees the heart. Forgiving yourself restores it." She stared at the sentence until the light turned green. Some lessons arrived through heartbreak. Others arrived through honest conversations. Both had the power to change a life. The next afternoon, after finishing another successful day at the youth center, Grace and Daniel locked the building together. As they walked toward the parking lot, Daniel hesitated. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Grace smiled. "What is it?" He looked almost unusually nervous. "I know this Saturday is your birthday." Grace stopped walking. "You remembered?" He smiled. "You mentioned it when we were organizing volunteer schedules." She laughed softly. "I forgot I told you. I was wondering." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "A few of the volunteers are having breakfast after the farmer's market." He looked at her calmly. "I thought you might enjoy joining us." Grace studied his expression. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a thoughtful invitation that included other friends. She smiled warmly. "I'd like that." Daniel returned the smile. "Good." Neither of them noticed Lisa watching from the front window. She smiled quietly to herself, not because two people might eventually fall in love, but because both of them had finally reached a place where trust came before romance. And that was always the stronger foundation. Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies and the familiar bustle of the Madison Farmers Market. Rows of colorful tents surrounded the Capitol Square. Fresh flowers filled wooden buckets. Local musicians played soft acoustic music near the fountain. Families wandered from stall to stall carrying coffee and warm pastries. Grace smiled as she parked a few blocks away. Birthdays had always been important to her. Not because of gifts, because her father had treated every birthday as a reminder that another year of life was something worth celebrating. After he passed away, her mother and Vanessa had continued the tradition. This year, however, Grace hadn't planned anything. A few months earlier, she had expected to spend this birthday finalizing the last details of her honeymoon. Life had taken another path. And somehow, she no longer felt disappointed. She spotted the volunteer group gathered near a bakery. Lisa waved enthusiastically. "Birthday girl." Grace laughed. "I was hoping you wouldn't announce it to the entire market." "Absolutely not." Lisa grinned. "I only told everyone standing within 50 feet. The group laughed. Daniel walked over, carrying a small paper bag. "Happy birthday." Grace smiled. "You really remembered." "I did." He handed her the bag. She looked at him uncertainly. "I thought we agreed not to buy each other things." He smiled. "We did." She opened the bag. Inside was a packet of wildflower seeds. Attached was a small handwritten note. "Every beautiful garden begins with something small." No jewelry, no expensive perfume, no elaborate display. Just a thoughtful gift that reflected everything they had spent weeks talking about. Grace looked up. "I love it." Daniel smiled. "I hoped you would." The group spent the next hour wandering through the market. Lisa bought fresh peaches. Several volunteers argued playfully over which bakery sold the best cinnamon rolls. Marcus and his mother unexpectedly arrived, and Marcus proudly introduced Grace to his grandmother. "She's the one I told you about." His grandmother shook Grace's hand warmly. "Thank you." Grace smiled. "For what?" "For helping my grandson smile again." Grace glanced toward Marcus, who was excitedly showing Daniel a model airplane made from recycled materials. "I think he did most of the work himself." His grandmother shook her head. "No." She smiled kindly. "Children bloom where they're encouraged." Grace felt those words settle gently in her heart. After breakfast, the volunteers slowly headed home. Soon, only Grace and Daniel remained. They walked through the market, without any particular destination. Daniel pointed toward a booth selling handmade journals. "I almost bought you another one." Grace laughed. "I've barely filled the first." "I know." I remembered just in time. They continued walking. Comfortable silence settled between them. Not awkward, simply peaceful. Eventually, Grace spoke. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." "I almost didn't come today." Daniel looked surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "My birthday felt strange this year." "Because of the wedding?" She smiled faintly. "I thought I'd spend today mourning what didn't happen." She looked around the busy market. "But instead—" "Oh!" She laughed softly. "I'm actually enjoying myself." Daniel nodded. "Sometimes healing sneaks up on us." As they reached the edge of the square, they found an empty bench beneath a large oak tree. Grace sat down. Daniel joined her. After watching people pass by for a few minutes, Grace asked quietly, "Can I ask you something personal?" He nodded. You said, Emily made ordinary days feel important. I did. Grace looked toward the children chasing pigeons nearby. What made your marriage work? Daniel smiled. He didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, we never tried to win against each other. Grace listened carefully. If one of us had a bad day, he continued. The other didn't ask, who's right? We asked, what does this situation need? Grace nodded slowly. We protected the relationship instead of protecting our pride. She smiled. I don't think I've ever heard anyone explain marriage that way. Daniel laughed quietly. Neither had I. Oh, Emily taught me. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally Grace whispered, I think I forgot that. Daniel looked at her. I spent so much time trying to keep peace. She admitted that I stopped noticing whether the relationship itself felt peaceful. Daniel didn't interrupt. I thought love meant sacrificing. She smiled sadly. But somewhere along the way, I forgot it should also feel safe. Daniel nodded gently. It should. There was no judgment in his voice. No criticism of Ethan, only quiet agreement. Later that afternoon, they returned to the youth center to prepare for the volunteer workshop they would be leading the following week. As they arranged chairs, Grace climbed onto a small step stool to hang a banner. Daniel looked up. Careful. I've got it. She reached a little farther. The stool shifted slightly. Before she could lose her balance, Daniel instinctively steadied the ladder with one hand. You okay? She looked down. Yes, but he smiled. I wasn't worried about the banner. Grace climbed down, laughing. I noticed. Once both feet were safely on the floor, he quietly stepped back. He hadn't grabbed her, hadn't overreacted. He had simply made sure she was safe. Then, respected her space. Grace realized something. Real protection didn't feel controlling. It felt reassuring. As they finished decorating the room, Lisa walked in carrying a folder. You two are impossible. Grace looked confused. What did we do? Lisa laughed. You finished tomorrow's setup today. Daniel shrugged. We had time. Lisa shook her head. I wish every volunteer team worked like this. She left still smiling. Grace watched her disappear down the hallway. She really likes planning ahead. Daniel laughed. So do you. I do not. He raised an eyebrow. You color-coded the storage closet. Grace looked guilty. It needed organization. It absolutely did. They both laughed. As the sun began setting, they carried the final supplies to the storage room. Daniel closed the door behind them. The hallway was quiet. Almost everyone else had gone home. He took a slow breath. Grace. She looked up. There's something I've been thinking about for a while. Her heart beat just a little faster. Not from fear. From uncertainty. Daniel looked directly at her. I don't want to make assumptions. I don't want to rush anything. She nodded. I appreciate that. He continued carefully. Our friendship has become important to me. Grace felt her chest tighten. He wasn't speaking impulsively. Every word was deliberate. I know you're still healing. And I respect that. He paused. I also know I'm still learning how to open my heart again. She waited quietly. So, I'm not asking for anything today. He smiled gently. I just wanted you to know that spending time with you has reminded me that hope is still possible. Grace felt tears fill her eyes. Not because he had confessed dramatic love, because he hadn't. He had simply told the truth, without pressure, without expectation, without trying to influence her answer. She smiled through the emotion. Thank you. Daniel looked relieved. I wasn't sure if I should say anything. I'm glad you did. She took a slow breath. I care about you too. His eyes softened. But... He nodded before she even finished. I know. She smiled. I'm still learning who I am, outside of the life I thought I was going to have. Daniel answered gently. And I'll never ask you to rush that. Those words settled deep inside her. For the first time in her life, Grace realized what emotional safety actually felt like. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't uncertainty. It wasn't wondering where she stood. It was knowing she could be completely honest without fear of losing someone's respect. As they walked out of the youth center together, the evening sky glowed with shades of gold and lavender. Neither reached for the other's hand. Neither felt the need to. Some relationships began with fireworks. Others began with trust. Grace was beginning to understand that the second kind often lasted much longer. Just before they reached the parking lot, Daniel smiled. I have one more question. Grace laughed. Go ahead. He looked almost boyish for the first time since she'd met him. When you're ready. He paused. Would you let me take you to dinner? Not because we're already something, but because I'd like the chance to discover what we could become. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. I'd like that. For the first time, the possibility of love didn't feel like replacing the past. It felt like honoring everything the past had taught her. Grace spent the next few days thinking about Daniel's invitation, not because she didn't know the answer. She already did. She had told him yes. What occupied her thoughts was something much deeper. She wanted to make sure she wasn't saying yes because she was lonely, or because she wanted to prove she had moved on, or because another relationship seemed like the next logical step. She had spent too many years making important decisions simply because they seemed expected. She wasn't going to do that again. This time, she wanted her answer to come from peace, not pressure. Wednesday afternoon, Grace met Vanessa for lunch at their favorite neighborhood cafe, the same little place where they had celebrated birthdays, promotions, and family milestones for years. Vanessa stirred her iced tea and smiled knowingly. So? Grace laughed. What? You've smiled 3 times in the last 2 minutes. I have not. You absolutely have. Grace shook her head. I guess I've been happier lately. Vanessa leaned forward. Does this happiness have a name? Grace smiled, despite herself. Maybe. Daniel. Grace laughed. You make it sound so obvious. It is. Grace grew thoughtful. I said yes. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. To dinner? Grace nodded. I'm happy for you. Grace looked down at her coffee. I almost feel guilty. Vanessa frowned. For what? For being happy. Vanessa reached across the table. Grace. You didn't stop loving Ethan because you met Daniel. Grace looked up. You stopped believing your future belonged with Ethan because you realized respect was missing. She paused. Daniel didn't create that truth. He simply entered your life after you accepted it. Grace sat quietly. Sometimes healing felt almost disloyal. Not because it actually was. Because pain could become so familiar that happiness felt undeserved. Vanessa smiled warmly. You're allowed to move forward. The following evening, Daniel arrived exactly on time, not a minute early, not a minute late. Grace noticed the small detail immediately. He stood outside her apartment building, holding a single sunflower. Not a bouquet, not roses, just one bright sunflower. When she opened the door, he smiled. I wasn't sure what flowers you liked. Grace accepted it carefully. My dad used to grow sunflowers. Daniel smiled. I didn't know that. You couldn't have. She looked at the flower. But somehow you chose perfectly. Daniel chuckled. I'll accept that little bit of luck. Instead of taking her to an expensive restaurant, Daniel drove toward the edge of Lake Mendota. Grace looked around curiously. I thought we were going to dinner. We are. He smiled. I just thought we'd start here. They walked along the shoreline. Sailboats drifted peacefully across the water. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the lake. Families sat on blankets, watching the sunset. Children skipped stones across the water. Daniel slipped his hands into his pockets. I used to come here after difficult days. Grace looked across the lake. I understand why. It reminds me that not everything needs to be solved immediately. She smiled. I've spent most of my adult life trying to solve everything immediately. I know. She looked at him. You know? He nodded. You carry responsibility naturally. Grace laughed softly. Is it that obvious? You notice everyone's needs before your own. She stopped walking for a moment. Nobody had ever described her that accurately. Has anyone ever taken care of you the way you take care of other people? The question caught her completely off guard. She searched her memories. Her father, before he passed away. Her mother, always. Vanessa, certainly. But in a romantic relationship, she struggled to think of a single example. Daniel noticed the silence. You don't have to answer. Grace smiled sadly. I think I already did. After their walk, they drove to a small Italian restaurant tucked between 2 historic downtown buildings. It wasn't crowded. Soft piano music played in the background. The owner greeted Daniel by name. You've been here before. Grace observed. Daniel nodded. Emily and I used to celebrate volunteer projects here. He looked at Grace. I wanted to tell you before we walked in, so you wouldn't feel surprised. Grace appreciated that. Thank you. He smiled. I never want you to feel compared to someone else. She looked at him carefully. I don't, he continued gently. Emily will always be part of my story. But she isn't the standard I'm asking anyone else to become. Grace felt herself relax. Honesty created room for trust. Secrets usually destroyed it. During dinner, They talked about everything except romance, favorite childhood memories, books, teachers who had changed their lives, the funniest mistakes they'd made at work. Grace laughed until tears formed when Daniel described accidentally presenting an upside-down blueprint during an important city meeting years earlier. "You actually did that?" "I did." "What happened?" The contractor politely asked if gravity had changed overnight. Grace burst into laughter. "I don't think I've ever laughed this much on a first date." Daniel smiled. "I was hoping you'd laugh." As dinner came to an end, the waitress brought the check. Grace reached for her purse. Daniel noticed. "I invited you." "I know, but I can pay for my meal." He smiled. "I believe you." She paused. He continued. "I'm paying because it was my invitation, not because I think you can't." Grace smiled. "I appreciate the difference." "So do I." The conversation lasted only a few seconds, yet it revealed something important. Neither of them viewed generosity as control, nor independence as rejection. Respect made room for both. Walking back toward the car, they passed a small street musician playing an old acoustic guitar. An elderly couple began dancing on the sidewalk. Not elegantly, not perfectly, just joyfully. Grace smiled. "They're adorable." Daniel nodded. "My grandparents used to dance in the kitchen." "No music?" "They said love keeps its own rhythm." Grace laughed. "I like your grandparents." "You would've." They watched the couple for another minute before continuing. Halfway to the parking lot, Grace slowed. "Daniel," he looked at her. "I want to thank you." "For dinner?" She shook her head. "For not trying to rescue me." He frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "A lot of people assumed I needed someone to fix my broken heart." She smiled gently. "You never treated me like I was broken." Daniel answered without hesitation. "Because you weren't. You were healing. Those aren't the same thing." Grace felt emotion rise in her chest. She had spent weeks hearing people say things like, "You'll find someone better. Everything happens for a reason. Just move on." Daniel had never said any of those things. He had simply walked beside her while she found her own way. That was far more valuable. As they reached her apartment building, Daniel turned off the engine. "I had a really nice evening." Grace smiled. "So did I." Neither moved immediately. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I don't expect an answer tonight." Grace looked puzzled. "An answer to what?" He smiled. "Whether you'd like another date." She laughed. "You really don't rush anything." "I've learned good things usually don't need rushing." Grace looked at him with quiet admiration. "I'd love another date." His smile widened. "I'm glad." She stepped out of the truck, then leaned back toward the open window. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Grace." As she walked toward her apartment, she realized something that made her stop halfway to the entrance. This was the first relationship she'd ever experienced where she never once wondered whether she was enough. Because Daniel had never made her feel as though she needed to earn kindness. And perhaps that was one of the clearest signs that what they were building wasn't based on excitement alone. It was being built on something far stronger. Mutual respect. The morning after their first date, Grace woke before sunrise. She expected to replay every conversation she and Daniel had shared. Instead, she found herself thinking about something else. How calm she had felt. There had been no pressure to impress him. No guessing what he wanted to hear. No wondering whether she had talked too much. No anxious urge to send a text explaining something she had already said. She simply felt peaceful. That realization surprised her more than the date itself. For years she had mistaken emotional uncertainty for excitement. Now she understood that peace could be far more powerful. At the youth center, volunteers were preparing for another busy day. Children hurried toward the reading room carrying books they wanted to exchange. Parents chatted with one another over coffee. Marcus was already helping a younger student find a beginner chapter book. Grace smiled as she watched him. Just weeks earlier, he had barely spoken to anyone. Now he was encouraging someone else. Healing had a way of spreading. One life touched another, then another. Lisa walked into the reading room carrying a newspaper. "You two made the front page." Grace looked confused. "We did?" Lisa unfolded the local community section. Across the top was a photograph of children gathered beneath the reading tent during the family fair. Grace and Daniel stood in the background helping several students choose books. The headline read, "Local volunteers help turn community center into a place of hope." Grace laughed softly. "I didn't even know anyone was taking pictures." Daniel looked at the article. The photographer focused on the kids. Grace smiled. As he should. Lisa folded the paper. "That's exactly why you two were successful." Neither of them had volunteered to receive recognition. They had volunteered because the work mattered. Around lunchtime, Grace received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID displayed a number she recognized immediately. Patricia Brooks, Ethan's mother. Grace hesitated before answering. Hello? Grace? Hi, Mrs. Brooks. There was a pause. I hope I'm not interrupting. No. I just... The older woman sighed. I wanted to tell you something. Grace stepped outside so they could speak privately. You've always treated our family with kindness. Patricia continued, no matter what happens in the future. I hope you know you'll always have my respect. Grace felt emotion rising in her throat. Thank you. Patricia's voice softened. Ethan has changed these past few weeks. Grace remained quiet. He isn't blaming you. He isn't blaming anyone. He's working very hard. Grace looked across the playground. I'm glad. Patricia continued gently. I didn't call to ask you to come back. Grace hadn't expected that. I called because I wanted you to know that sometimes the people who love us also need someone brave enough to tell them the truth. Tears filled Grace's eyes. I hope he keeps growing. So do I. After they ended the call, Grace stood outside for several minutes. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't always about restoring a relationship. Sometimes it meant sincerely hoping another person became better, even if their future no longer included you. That afternoon, Daniel noticed Grace seemed thoughtful. You okay? She nodded. I heard from Ethan's mother. He waited. She said he's changing. Daniel smiled gently. I hope that's true. Grace looked at him. I do too. She expected him to feel uncomfortable, jealous perhaps. Instead, he simply continued organizing books. After a few moments he spoke. Someone becoming healthier is always good news. Grace stared at him. Even if it's someone connected to your past? Daniel looked up. Especially then. She smiled. You really mean that? I do. He shrugged lightly. The world needs more healed people. Grace laughed. I've never met anyone who thinks quite like you. Daniel smiled. My grandfather would say that's either a compliment or a warning. She laughed even harder. Later that afternoon, Lisa asked Grace and Daniel to help interview new volunteer mentors. One applicant stood out immediately. A young college student named Olivia seemed nervous. I'm not sure I'm qualified. Grace smiled kindly. Why do you want to volunteer? Olivia looked down. When I was little. She hesitated. A reading tutor helped me after my parents divorced. She swallowed. I thought maybe I could do that for someone else. Grace exchanged a glance with Daniel. Neither needed to say anything. The best volunteers weren't always the most experienced. Often they were simply people who remembered what kindness had once meant to them. As the interviews ended, Olivia approached Grace. Can I ask you something? Of course. How do you know if you're making a difference? Grace thought for a moment. Then she pointed toward Marcus. He was helping Emma choose another book. You probably won't notice it all at once. Grace said, but one day. You'll watch someone who once needed encouragement become the person encouraging someone else. Olivia smiled. I like that. So do I. That evening, Grace drove to the cemetery where her father was buried. She visited several times each year. Whenever life reached an important crossroads, she placed fresh sunflowers beside the headstone, then sat quietly on the nearby bench. I wish you were here. She smiled softly. You would have liked Daniel. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers. Grace looked toward the fading sunset. I finally understand something you tried to teach me. She remembered her father telling her years earlier. Never choose someone simply because they choose you. Choose someone who makes it easier to become the person you were created to be. At 22, she hadn't fully understood. At 34, she finally did. The following morning, Daniel stopped by the reading room before the children arrived. I have some news. Grace looked up. What happened? The city called. She smiled. Good news? I think so. He handed her a folder. Inside was an official proposal. The city wanted him to lead a year-long community revitalization project in Milwaukee. Grace read the document carefully. It's an incredible opportunity. Daniel nodded. It is. She looked at him. But, he smiled faintly. It would mean moving. The room became quiet. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Grace folded the proposal and handed it back. When do you have to decide? 2 weeks. Grace nodded slowly. This is important. It is. He looked out the window. I've spent years hoping for an opportunity like this. She could hear the conflict in his voice. He wasn't asking her to solve it. He was simply sharing it. Grace smiled gently. I know one thing. He looked at her. Whatever decision you make, I hope it's the one you'll still be proud of 10 years from now. Daniel smiled. You always know how to make things both simpler and harder. Grace laughed. I've been told that before. As Daniel walked toward the hallway, Grace remained by the window. Life had presented them with another choice. Not one born from crisis, not one born from heartbreak, but one that would test something just as important. Could two people who cared deeply about each other make room for both love and purpose? She had a feeling the answer would shape not only their future, but the kind of relationship they hoped to build. For the next several days, Daniel kept the Milwaukee proposal tucked inside the top drawer of his desk. He didn't ignore it. He simply refused to rush it. Every evening after the volunteers left, he read through the documents again. The position offered everything he had worked toward for years. A larger budget, a bigger team, the opportunity to redesign parks, community centers, and neighborhoods across an entire region. Professionally, it was the kind of opportunity engineers dreamed about. Personally, it complicated everything. Grace noticed the change almost immediately. Daniel still smiled, still greeted every volunteer warmly, still remembered every child's name. But there was a quiet weight behind his eyes. One afternoon, while organizing donations, she finally asked, "You've been carrying something around all week." Daniel looked up from the clipboard. "Is it that obvious?" She smiled. "You've checked the same inventory list 3 times. He laughed softly. "I guess I have." She leaned against one of the bookshelves. "Want to talk?" He hesitated. "I do." He folded the clipboard and set it aside. "I'm afraid." Grace looked surprised. "Of what?" He took a slow breath. "I'm afraid that whatever decision I make." He looked toward the window. "Someone important will lose." Grace listened carefully. "If I accept the position, I leave everything we've built here." He paused. "If I stay, I may spend years wondering what might have happened." Grace nodded slowly. Those were the hardest choices in life. Not between good and bad. Between two good things that couldn't both exist at the same time. That evening, they stayed late preparing reading certificates for the children. Stacks of colorful paper covered the tables. Grace carefully tied blue ribbons around each certificate. Daniel sorted names alphabetically. The quiet room filled with comfortable silence. Finally, Grace spoke. "My dad used to tell me something." Daniel looked up. "He said that every meaningful choice costs you something." Daniel smiled thoughtfully. "I like that. I didn't when I was younger." She laughed softly. "I thought the right decision would always feel easy." "It rarely does." She nodded. "The difficult part isn't giving something up. It's deciding what matters most." Daniel looked at the certificate in his hands. "What matters most?" He quietly repeated the words. The next morning, Grace met Vanessa for breakfast before work. As soon as she sat down, Vanessa smiled. "You've got that thinking face again." Grace laughed. "Apparently everyone notices." "They do." Grace stirred her coffee. "Daniel was offered a job in Milwaukee." Vanessa's smile softened. "Oh, it's an amazing opportunity. I can tell by your face." Grace looked down. "I don't know what I want him to do." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "You don't?" Grace shook her head. "I want him to follow his purpose." She paused. "But selfishly." She smiled sadly. "I also don't want him to leave." Vanessa reached across the table. "Then don't make him choose." Grace looked confused. "What do you mean?" "If you love someone, Vanessa said gently, "don't ask them to become smaller, so they'll fit into your life." Grace sat quietly. Those words stayed with her. Healthy love didn't demand that another person abandon meaningful dreams. It looked for ways to honor both people. Later that afternoon, the youth center hosted its weekly reading celebration. Children gathered in the main hall to receive certificates for reaching their reading goals. Marcus walked confidently across the stage. When Lisa handed him his certificate, the room erupted in applause. Grace smiled proudly. Only 2 months earlier, Marcus had refused to speak to anyone. Now, he stood in front of dozens of families with confidence. After the ceremony, Marcus walked over holding his certificate. "I did it." Grace smiled. "You absolutely did." Marcus looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Daniel says bridges are stronger when everybody helps build them." Daniel laughed. "I do say that." Marcus looked back at Grace. "So," he grinned proudly, "you helped build me." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. She knelt until they were eye level. "No, Marcus." She smiled warmly. "You built yourself. We just reminded you that you could." Marcus hugged her before running back to his mother. Daniel watched quietly. "You always know what to say." Grace shook her head. "No, I've just had really good teachers. That evening, Daniel visited Emily's grave for the first time in several months. He placed fresh white lilies beside the headstone. For a while, he simply stood there. Then he smiled. I met someone. The words felt strange spoken aloud. Not because they were wrong, because they marked a chapter he never imagined reaching. I think you'd like her. He looked down at the flowers. She reminds me that kindness isn't rare. He laughed quietly. You were right. The breeze moved gently through the trees. Daniel closed his eyes. I'm finally learning that loving again doesn't mean I've loved you less. He stood there several minutes longer before walking back toward his truck. For the first time since Emily's death, he didn't feel guilty for hoping. He simply felt grateful. The following afternoon, Grace and Daniel walked through the city park, reviewing ideas for expanding next year's mentoring program. Children played soccer nearby. Parents watched from folding chairs. Daniel stopped beside the small pedestrian bridge. You remember what my grandfather used to say? Grace smiled. About bridges? He nodded. They're strong because every piece supports the others. She laughed. I've quoted him twice this week. Daniel looked out across the water. I've been thinking about the Milwaukee job. Grace waited. I realized something. What? I kept asking whether the job was worth leaving. He smiled thoughtfully. But I never asked whether staying would eventually make me resent what I gave up. Grace nodded slowly. That's an important question. He looked at her. What would you do? Grace thought carefully before answering. I wouldn't decide based on fear. He remained silent. I wouldn't stay simply because I was afraid of losing someone. And I wouldn't leave simply because I was afraid of missing an opportunity. She smiled gently. I'd choose the life that allows me to become the person I want to be. Daniel looked at her with quiet admiration. You make difficult questions sound honest. She laughed. They're still difficult. I know. As they reached the parking lot, Daniel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. City Engineering Department. He answered. Hello? Grace stepped away to give him privacy. Several minutes later, he returned. They need my answer by Friday. Grace nodded. That's soon. It is. Neither of them spoke during the drive back to the youth center. Not because anything was wrong, because both understood that some decisions required quiet more than conversation. When they arrived, Daniel turned off the engine. Thank you. Grace looked at him. For what? For never trying to influence my decision. She smiled. I care about you too much to decide your future for you. Daniel nodded. And that's exactly why your opinion matters. As Grace walked toward the building, she realized something profound. Love wasn't measured by how tightly you held on to someone. Sometimes it was measured by how willing you were to let them choose freely, even when the outcome was uncertain. Friday morning arrived with a quiet sense of anticipation. No one at the youth center knew that by the end of the day, Daniel would make one of the biggest decisions of his career. Grace knew. Lisa knew. Daniel knew. Everyone else simply noticed that he seemed unusually thoughtful. Even Marcus looked up from his book and asked, Mr. Daniel? Daniel smiled. Yeah, buddy. You forgot your coffee. The room filled with laughter. Daniel looked down at the untouched cup sitting beside his clipboard. I guess I did. Marcus grinned proudly. My grandma says people forget little things when they're thinking about big things. Daniel laughed. Your grandma sounds very wise. She is. Marcus picked up his book again, as though he'd solved the mystery. Grace smiled from across the room. Children often noticed more than adults realized. Around mid-morning, Daniel received another call from the engineering department. He stepped outside to answer. Grace remained inside organizing mentor schedules. She had promised herself she wouldn't wonder what he was saying. She trusted him. Trust, she was learning, wasn't about knowing everything. It was about not needing to. Several minutes later, Daniel returned. Lisa looked at him. They're giving me until 5 o'clock. Grace nodded quietly. That gives you a little more time. He smiled. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Children practiced for next week's reading celebration. Volunteers assembled backpacks filled with school supplies. Parents stopped by to thank the mentoring team before the summer program ended. One father approached Grace with tears in his eyes. I don't know what you all did. He looked toward his daughter, reading quietly in the corner. But this is the first summer she's wanted to visit a community program every single week. Grace smiled warmly. She did the hard part. No. The father shook his head. You gave her a place where she believed she belonged. Grace glanced around the room. Maybe that was what every healthy relationship was supposed to do. Help people believe they belonged without asking them to become someone else first. At exactly 4:30, Daniel walked outside alone. He crossed the small garden volunteers had planted together months earlier. The purple coneflowers were blooming beautifully now. He stopped beside the wooden bench where he and Grace had once discussed patience. Flowers couldn't be forced to bloom. People couldn't be rushed into healing. He smiled to himself. His grandfather would have liked this garden. A few moments later, Grace quietly joined him. She didn't ask about the decision. She simply sat beside him. For nearly 5 minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I've made up my mind." Grace turned toward him. He looked calmer than he had all week. "I called the city." She waited. "I thanked them. And I turned the position down." Grace stared at him, not because she expected that answer, because she wanted to make sure she understood why. Daniel smiled gently. "Before you say anything." She nodded. "I didn't stay because of you." Grace felt relief. He continued, "I stayed because I realized my purpose isn't measured by the size of the city I work in." He looked toward the youth center. "It's measured by whether the work still matters." He smiled. "And it still matters." Grace reached over and squeezed his hand for just a moment. "I'm proud of you." He looked at her. "You know something?" "What?" "For the first time in my career, I made a decision based on what I truly valued, not on what looked impressive." Grace smiled. "That's a good feeling." "It is." The following Monday brought another surprise. The mayor of Madison visited the youth center. Volunteers gathered as she walked through the renovated classrooms. She stopped in the reading room. "I've heard wonderful things about this place." Lisa smiled proudly. "We've had amazing volunteers." The mayor nodded. "I can see that." She turned toward Daniel. "I understand you declined Milwaukee's offer." Daniel looked surprised. "Word travels quickly." She laughed. "It does." Then she smiled warmly. "I'd like to offer you something instead." She handed him a folder. Inside was a proposal for a new position, Director of Community Development Projects. Madison Daniel looked stunned. "It allows you to continue leading projects like this one," she explained, "and expand them throughout the city." He looked at Grace, then back at the proposal. Sometimes choosing one path didn't mean giving up every opportunity. Sometimes it simply opened a different door. That evening, Grace met her mother for dinner. Patricia smiled as soon as Grace walked through the door. "You've been glowing lately." Grace laughed. "I don't know about glowing." "You are." Her mother poured 2 cups of tea. "So," Grace smiled knowingly, "you want to ask about Daniel?" "I do." Grace told her everything. The community project, the Milwaukee decision, the new opportunity in Madison. When she finished, Patricia sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked, "How do you feel when you're with him?" Grace didn't answer immediately. Finally she smiled. "Like I don't have to audition." Her mother looked confused. Grace laughed softly. "I know that sounds strange." "No?" Patricia smiled. "It sounds healthy." Grace looked down at her tea. "I've realized something." "What?" "I spent years trying to become the version of myself I thought someone else wanted." She looked up. "Daniel makes me want to become the best version of myself. Not because he expects it, but because I feel safe enough to grow." Patricia reached across the table. "My father used to tell me." She smiled. "The right person doesn't complete your life. They encourage you to fully live it." Grace squeezed her mother's hand. "I think I'm finally beginning to understand." Later that week, the volunteers gathered for one final summer celebration. Children proudly displayed the books they had finished. Parents shared stories about new reading routines at home. Marcus stood in front of everyone holding a microphone. Only a few months earlier, he had barely spoken above a whisper. Now he smiled confidently. "I want to say thank you." He looked toward Grace and Daniel. "You helped us believe we could do hard things." The room filled with applause. Grace looked at Daniel. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Some rewards couldn't be measured by promotions, or salaries, or recognition. They were measured by lives quietly changed. As the celebration came to an end, Daniel walked Grace to her car. The evening air felt cool, comfortable, peaceful. He smiled. "I've been thinking." Grace laughed. "That usually means something important." "It does." He looked at her with calm certainty. "I think I'm finally ready to ask you a question." Grace's heart beat just a little faster, not because she feared the answer, because she already knew it would come from a place of honesty. "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow?" Grace laughed. "We've already done that." "I know." He smiled. "But tomorrow?" "Oh," he paused. "I'd like to ask a different question." Grace looked into his eyes. Whatever came next, she knew one thing. This wasn't a relationship built on impulse. It had been built choice by choice. Until love became the most natural consequence of all. Grace hardly slept that night, not because she was nervous, because she was grateful. A year earlier she would have spent an evening like this wondering what she should wear, rehearsing conversations in her head, and worrying about saying the wrong thing. Now, she simply felt present. She smiled as she opened the navy blue journal Daniel had given her months before. Most of its pages were filled now. She turned to the very first entry. Today I realized that peace feels unfamiliar when you've spent years confusing anxiety with commitment. She read the sentence twice before flipping to the final blank page. After a long moment she wrote, "Today, peace feels like home." She closed the journal gently. Healing hadn't happened because time had passed. It had happened because she had made hundreds of small choices. Choosing honesty, choosing healthy boundaries, choosing forgiveness, choosing herself. Those choices had quietly changed her life. The next evening, Daniel arrived at her apartment right on time. When Grace opened the door, she smiled. "You look nice." Daniel laughed softly. "I was hoping you'd say that." He wore a simple navy blazer, a light blue shirt, and dark jeans. Nothing extravagant. Grace wore a cream-colored summer dress and the sunflower earrings her mother had given her years ago. Daniel noticed them immediately. "Those are beautiful. They belong to my grandmother. They suit you." "So does honesty." Daniel laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." Instead of driving toward downtown, Daniel headed west. Grace looked out the window as the city slowly gave way to open fields, quiet country roads, and gently rolling hills. "Where are we going?" "You'll see." She laughed. "That's suspicious." "I prefer the word patient." She smiled. "You've always been good at patience." He glanced at her briefly. "I've had an excellent teacher." About 30 minutes later, they arrived at a small lakeside park just outside Madison. Grace stepped out of the truck and looked around. The lake reflected the orange glow of the setting sun. Wildflowers covered the hillside. A wooden dock stretched quietly into the water. Near the shoreline stood a single picnic table. It wasn't decorated with balloons. There were no photographers hiding behind trees. No violinists waiting to appear. Just 2 picnic baskets, a blanket, and the peaceful sound of water touching the shore. Grace smiled. "This is perfect." Daniel looked relieved. "I was hoping you'd think so." They spread the blanket beneath a large oak tree. Dinner was simple. Fresh sandwiches from the cafe where they had shared their first lunch. Fruit, homemade cookies baked by Lisa, and lemonade prepared by Marcus's grandmother after she insisted, "No celebration is complete without it." Grace laughed when Daniel explained where everything had come from. "This is very much a community effort." He nodded. "I figured that's how our story began." She looked around. "And that's how you wanted tonight to feel." "Exactly." As they ate, they talked about the past several months. Marcus finishing his 10th book. Emma reading aloud during the community celebration. Olivia becoming one of the youth center's most dependable mentors. The new citywide mentoring program beginning in the fall. Grace smiled. "We've been busy." Daniel laughed. "We have." She looked across the lake. "You know something?" "What?" "When I first came to the youth center." She paused. "I thought I was volunteering because I needed something to distract me." Daniel listened quietly. "I didn't realize I was walking into the place where I'd learn how healthy love actually looks." He smiled gently. "I don't think either of us expected that." The sun dipped lower. Golden light reflected across the calm water. Daniel stood. "I'd like to show you something." Grace followed him toward the dock. They walked slowly until they reached the very end. The lake stretched endlessly before them. Daniel rested his hands on the wooden railing. "My grandfather brought me here when I was 16. Grace looked around. "It's beautiful. He told me something I've never forgotten." She smiled. "I was wondering when your grandfather would appear." Daniel laughed. "He always seems to." They both smiled. He pointed at this lake and said, "Oh." Daniel looked toward the horizon. "The strongest foundations aren't built where the water is loud. They're built where it's steady." Grace looked across the peaceful water. "I think he was talking about more than lakes." He was. For several moments, they stood in comfortable silence. Finally, Daniel turned toward her. "Grace." She met his eyes. "I've spent a long time thinking about what I wanted to say tonight." He took a slow breath. "I've rewritten this conversation in my head dozens of times." She smiled softly. "I believe you. I finally realized something." "What?" "I don't want to promise you a perfect life." Grace listened. "I can't promise we'll never disagree. I can't promise we'll never face difficult seasons. I can't promise that either of us will always know the right thing to say. She nodded gently. None of us can. He smiled. But I can promise something else. He took one small step closer. I will never make you feel like loving you is a burden. Tears immediately filled Grace's eyes. Daniel continued. I will never ask you to become smaller so I can feel bigger. I will never use your kindness as a joke. I will never stop learning how to respect you. His voice remained calm, steady. I'll apologize when I'm wrong. I'll listen before I defend myself. I'll protect our relationship before I protect my pride. Grace covered her mouth with one trembling hand. These weren't dramatic promises. They were practical ones. Promises that could actually be lived. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. Grace's heart skipped. He slowly removed a small wooden box. Not velvet, handcrafted walnut. Simple, beautiful. She looked at it curiously. You made that? He smiled. I had help. Marcus insisted the lid needed better hinges. Grace laughed through her tears. Of course he did. Daniel carefully opened the box. Inside rested an elegant engagement ring. Not oversized, not extravagant, just timeless. He looked directly into her eyes. Then, slowly, he knelt on one knee. The evening breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the lake. The world seemed to grow wonderfully quiet. Grace Mitchell. His voice remained steady. You taught me that trust is built one ordinary choice at a time. You reminded me that hope isn't something we find. It's something we choose. He smiled. You've never asked me to forget my past. You've simply helped me believe I could still have a future. He took a careful breath. So, today, I'm not asking you to rescue me. I'm not asking you to complete me. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to continue building a life with me. One honest choice at a time. He looked at her with warmth, patience, and complete sincerity. Grace. Will you marry me? Grace felt tears streaming down her face. Not because of the ring, not because of the proposal, but because, for the first time in her life, someone had asked for her hand without making her feel like she had to earn the right to be loved. She smiled through her tears, opened her mouth to answer, and in that beautiful moment, before a single word left her lips, the future waited quietly for the choice that would change both of their lives forever. Grace looked into Daniel's eyes. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The lake, the evening breeze, the distant sound of birds settling into the trees. All she could see was the man kneeling before her. Not a man trying to impress her, not a man trying to convince her. A man making a promise through humility instead of spectacle. She smiled through her tears. Then she quietly said the one word Daniel had hoped for, but never expected. Yes. Daniel closed his eyes for just a second, letting out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A laugh escaped him. Not a loud laugh. The kind that comes when relief and gratitude arrive at the same time. You just made me the happiest man on this lake. Grace laughed, wiping away her tears. I think we're the only two people on this lake. Then I definitely stand by my statement. They both laughed. Daniel carefully slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Grace looked down at it. It sparkled softly in the fading sunlight. Beautiful, elegant. But what mattered most wasn't the ring. It was everything it represented. Respect, patience, honesty, the freedom to be completely herself. Daniel stood. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. Then he gently wrapped his arms around her. Grace hugged him back. Not tightly, not desperately, just peacefully. Neither of them needed to hold on out of fear. They held one another because they had chosen to walk through life together. A week later, the news spread through the community faster than either of them expected. Lisa was the first to call. I've been waiting for this phone call. Grace laughed. Were you? Since the day you argued over where to put the bookshelves. Grace smiled. You noticed? I notice everything. Within an hour, volunteers, parents and friends began sending messages. Marcus's mother wrote, Thank you for showing my son what healthy adults look like. Olivia sent, You two taught me that kindness is a strength, not a weakness. Even the mayor sent congratulations along with a note that read, Our city is better because people like you chose to stay. Grace read every message slowly. She realized something. Love had never existed in isolation. Healthy relationships strengthened entire communities. Children learned from them. Families benefited from them. Friends found hope because of them. That responsibility felt meaningful, not heavy, just meaningful. 2 days later, Grace received one final message she hadn't expected. It was from Ethan. She looked at the screen for a long moment before opening it. Congratulations, Grace. Someone told me you got engaged. I genuinely hope your future is filled with the kind of peace you always deserved. Meeting with you months ago changed my life more than you probably realize. I've spent this year learning how to become a better man. Not because I expected another chance, but because I finally understood that respect isn't something you feel, it's something you practice every day. Thank you for loving me enough to tell me the truth, even when it cost you both. Take care. Grace read the message twice. Then she smiled. Not because it made her question her future, because it confirmed that walking away had not destroyed Ethan. It had challenged him to grow. She quietly typed a reply. Thank you, Ethan. I'm sincerely happy that you're continuing to grow. I wish you a life filled with wisdom, meaningful relationships, and the courage to keep becoming the man you want to be. Take care of yourself. She pressed send. Then she placed her phone on the table. There was nothing more that needed to be said. Some stories ended with anger. Theirs ended with understanding. Autumn arrived in Madison with brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. The youth center launched its expanded mentoring program. Olivia became one of its lead coordinators. Marcus volunteered as a junior reading mentor for younger children. Emma proudly announced she wanted to become a teacher someday. The Peace Corner remained the most visited room in the building. One afternoon, Grace found a handwritten note taped to the wall inside. It simply read, "Thank you for making this a place where people feel safe." She smiled. No one had signed it. They didn't need to. The message belonged to everyone. 6 months later, Grace and Daniel stood in the same lakeside park where he had proposed. Only this time, rows of white chairs overlooked the water. Family, friends, volunteers, children from the youth center, neighbors, teachers, even city officials had gathered to celebrate. Lisa cried before the ceremony even began. Vanessa teased her gently. "I thought I was supposed to be the emotional one." Lisa laughed through her tears. "I've earned this." Marcus proudly carried the wedding rings. He walked carefully down the aisle, whispering to himself, "Don't drop them, don't drop them." When he reached Daniel, he smiled with relief. "I did it." "You certainly did," Daniel whispered back. Grace walked down the aisle beside her mother. Not because someone needed to replace her father, but because Patricia had helped carry Grace through every difficult season since his passing. When Grace reached the front, Daniel smiled in exactly the same quiet way he had the day they first met. No performance, no grand display, just genuine happiness. The officiant welcomed everyone before saying, "Today isn't simply about two people falling in love. It's about two people choosing every day to honor one another with honesty, patience, and respect." Grace looked at Daniel. He smiled. Those words perfectly described the life they wanted to build. Instead of writing elaborate vows, they had each chosen one simple promise. Daniel spoke first. "I promise that our home will always be a place where respect speaks louder than pride." Grace smiled through tears. Then she spoke. "I promise that I will never confuse silence with peace, or sacrifice my voice for the sake of comfort." Daniel squeezed her hands gently. The officiant smiled warmly. "Love isn't something that happens to us. It's something we build, one honest choice at a time." Moments later, they were pronounced husband and wife. As family and friends applauded, Daniel kissed Grace gently. Not as the ending of a fairy tale, but as the beginning of a partnership they had both worked hard to deserve. That evening, after the celebration ended, Grace and Daniel walked alone to the end of the same wooden dock where he had proposed. The stars reflected across the calm water. Grace rested her head lightly against his shoulder. "Can I tell you something?" Daniel smiled. "Always." She looked out across the lake. "If I hadn't gone to Ethan's pre-wedding celebration." Daniel nodded. "I know. I almost stayed home." She laughed softly. "It's strange. The smallest decision changed my entire life." Daniel squeezed her hand. "Sometimes that's how life works." She smiled. "I used to think the biggest moments shaped us. The proposal, the wedding, the heartbreak." She looked at him. "Now I think it's the small choices. Showing up, listening, apologizing, keeping promises, treating people kindly." Daniel smiled. "Those are the choices that become a life." Grace nodded. "They certainly became ours." They stood there together, in comfortable silence. The lake remained as peaceful as it had the day Daniel proposed. Steady, unhurried, enduring. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Love is rarely built by one extraordinary moment. It is built by thousands of ordinary choices, made with honesty, respect, patience, and courage. Those choices shape not only relationships, but the people we become. Thank you for spending this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. What small choice has changed your life in a way you never expected? Share your story in the comments. Someone reading it may find the hope or courage they need today. And if you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartfelt story about love, second chances, and the life-changing power of choosing respect over pride. Until next time, remember, the strongest love stories aren't built on perfect moments. They're built one honest choice at a time. We've reached the end of Grace and Daniel's journey, and now we'd love to hear from you. This story began with one painful sentence: "I can't believe I'm stuck with her for life." But it ended with a promise built on something much stronger: respect, honesty, and the freedom to choose each other every single day. Now it's your turn. What was the biggest life lesson you learned from this story? Was it that words have consequences, that self-respect sometimes requires walking away, that people can grow, even if they don't always get a second chance? Or that the healthiest love is built through small, consistent choices rather than grand romantic gestures? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story or perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring American love story filled with meaningful life lessons. Thank you for spending this journey with us. Your support, comments, and shares help this community continue growing and inspire us to bring you more heartfelt stories every week. Until next time, remember, choose people who make it easier to become your best self, and be that kind of person for someone else.